As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Now, in conclusion, let us say a very few words about Aristotle's politics. For the most part, in his political writings, Aristotle contented himself with describing existing states in the ancient world and making recommendations for their improvement within the framework of their basic premises. Aristotle was not a political revolutionary with fundamentally original ideas in politics, certainly not on the order at least of Plato, who, regardless of the content of his views, was a major innovator in politics. Aristotle is more the documenter rather than the crusader in politics, and his politics is therefore less interesting or important than any other part of his philosophy. In general, to merely synopsize a few of his conclusions, he was not a major collectivist like Plato. He objected vigorously to Plato's communistic and totalitarian views, but Aristotle himself, his own political writings, was certainly not a major individualist either. Now, it's one thing to say that his metaphysics and ethics laid the basis for which his subsequent followers centuries later derived individualism. That is true. But judging simply by the actual politics Aristotle himself recommends, which reflects the more Platonic elements in him, you'd have to say, in effect, that Aristotle unfortunately followed his golden mean in politics. He took a position that today would be pretty much described as a variant of the middle of the road. For instance, he objected to Plato's view that the few ideal philosophers should have absolute power. He objected to rule by Platonic experts. But he says this would be ideal, only it's impractical and utopian because it's too much risk of it degenerating into tyranny. You see, conceding to Plato that this would be ideal, but simply impractical. He also objected to rule by experts on the grounds that we must have, he says, a government of law, not of men. That is a central Aristotelian idea. A constitution must be defined, which spells out what the government can and cannot do. There must be laws. And we do not want a government by arbitrary decree. In this sense, he's the father of the idea of constitutional government. On the other hand, like Plato, Aristotle has no concept that all men have individual inalienable rights or that the function of government is only to protect these rights. As was common in Greece at the time, he was thinking of the state as the city-state, of course, and he thought that it had a variety of proper functions: educational, cultural, religious, economic. He says somewhere that it should see that there are restrictions on the amount of wealth, so there's not too much or too little in any given person's hands. In general, he advocates functions of the government quite incompatible with anything that an individualist politics would advocate.
Netanyahu says the hostage deal would only delay an attack on Rafah. So Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu explained that if Israel agrees to a new hostage deal with Hamas, it would only delay the Israeli attack on Rafah. International aid organizations have warned that an attack on the city of 1.5 million will be devastating to the civilian population. So there was some progress when it comes to the hostage deal negotiations. The U.S., Egypt, and Qatar, they presented a new outline for a hostage deal to Israel during these talks on Friday that I think were held in Paris. And apparently the outline would be a 6-week pause in fighting in exchange for the release of 40 Israeli captives. Hamas, I think there's about a little over 100 who are still left in Gaza, so they would release 40. That would probably be, the remaining non-soldiers. And Israel would also release a few hundred Palestinians. But this deal was worked out between the U.S., Egypt, and Qatar. So again, they presented it to Israel. So it's not clear if either side is going to go for this thing. But at least that's the potential deal that is on the table. But still, you have Hamas is their top priority has been trying to end this thing permanently, permanent ceasefire. And Netanyahu, what he said in this is basically that even if we agree to this deal, once the ceasefire is over, we're going to go right back at it, and that includes the attack on Rafah. He said, quote, "Once we begin the Rafah operation, the intense phase of fighting is weeks away from completion, not months. If we don't have a deal, we'll do it anyway," end quote. So saying if there is no deal, they're going to do it. And I know Benny Gantz said that they would do it by Ramadan if there was no deal, which starts on March 10th. But also, if there is a deal, they're going to do it again anyway. Now, I think it'll be much harder for Netanyahu to restart if there's a 6-week ceasefire, if there's 6 weeks of calm in Gaza. There's going to be a lot of pressure on him not to restart it, internationally at least. I don't think the U.S. is going to put any pressure on him. Unfortunately, we haven't seen any change in thinking when it comes to the unconditional military support. But this goes to show that, his plan is to keep this thing going, really, no matter what, hostage deal or no hostage deal. It's from Will Porter at the Libertarian Institute, and it says that the planned expansion of Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank is inconsistent with international law, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said, potentially signaling a policy shift for Washington. Speaking to media in Buenos Aires on Friday, the top U.S. diplomat addressed reports that Tel Aviv intends to construct thousands of new settlement units across the West Bank, saying that the White House was disappointed by the news. This was something that was announced by Bezalel Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister, who's also a minister in the defense ministry, and in that minister position, he's basically in charge of the West Bank. And this guy is a settler himself and explicitly wants to kick all the Palestinians out of there. So Blinken said, quote, "Our administration maintains a firm opposition to settlement expansion. And in our judgment, this only weakens and does not strengthen Israel's security," end quote. And then he added that settlements were inconsistent with international law and counterproductive to reaching enduring peace. And these comments appear to mark a return to previous U.S. policy, which for decades regarded Israel's racially exclusive colonies as a clear violation of international law. Again, U.S. officials are surprised by Houthi capabilities. So this is another one from Kyle, and it says that Joe Biden administration officials admitted that 6 weeks into the undeclared war in Yemen, the U.S. and U.K. strikes have failed to erode the Houthis' military capabilities. The official said that the U.S. is surprised at the Houthis' military capabilities and that Washington has a limited understanding of how advanced their weapons systems are. So, again, since the U.S. started bombing Yemen in January, we have just seen an escalation of Houthi attacks, especially in the past week or two. And what this is based on a CNN report, U.S. officials speaking to CNN, they basically say that they have no idea how much damage they're actually doing to the Houthis, and that they're surprised that they're able to keep increasing these attacks. One senior U.S. official said, quote, "They continue to surprise us. We just don't have a good idea of what they still have," end quote. And other officials are saying that they might escalate into targeting Houthi leadership, so starting to kill, higher up, high-level Houthi officials. And what's interesting is that this report also says that some administration officials now believe the best way to end the conflict is by ending the war in Gaza. Who would have thought that? And those officials believe that the Houthis will be faithful to their stated policy that the strikes on shipping will end once the Israeli onslaught in Gaza concludes. So hopefully more and more officials in the U.S. government begin to understand that. But unfortunately, right now, it seems like escalation is the name of the game here. So NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that Ukraine has the right to hit Russian military targets outside of Ukraine. The remarks were made as members of the North Atlantic Alliance are preparing to send Kiev weapons with longer ranges. The Kremlin has explained that it will claim more Ukrainian territory to offset the threat presented by the long-range arms. Stoltenberg said, quote, "Ukraine has the right to self-defense, and that includes also striking legitimate military targets, Russian military targets outside of Ukraine. This is international law, and of course, Ukraine has the right to do so to protect itself," end quote. So apparently this is the first time that Stoltenberg explicitly endorsed Ukrainian attacks inside Russia. So very, very provocative statement here from NATO, and very concerning.
Mercy Otis Warren, and she had 18 main objections to the Constitution, but she grounded her entire case in the principles of the American Revolution in opposition to centralized, consolidated power. I'm going to highlight some of the juiciest warnings. You can, of course, read the whole thing. It's a pretty long one, especially where the one where she predicts everything would lead to an uncontrolled despotism. But let's kick it off here, right from her. Well, if I can find my notes here, right from the first sentence, she says, "Mankind may amuse themselves with theoretic systems of liberty and trace its social and moral effects on sciences, virtue, industry, and every improvement of which the human mind is capable. But we can only discern its true value by the practical and wretched effects of slavery. And thus dreadfully will they be realized when the inhabitants of the eastern states are dragging out a miserable existence only on the gleanings of their fields, and the southern, blessed with a softer and more fertile climate, are languishing in hopeless poverty." She's saying, okay, when this type of scenario, when we are living that, they're going to ask, when asked, what has become of the flower of their crop and the rich produce of their farms? They may answer in the hapless style of the man of La Mancha, The exigencies of government require that the collectors of the revenue should transmit it to the federal city. And I'm pretty sure this is a reference to Don Quixote, published in the early 17th century. Not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. In other words, don't live in some kind of crazy fantasy land. But in reality, the reality that you're going to live in is going to be all power and wealth will end in the federal city, the center. She continues. She said, animated with the firmest zeal for the interest. She was a playwright, and she wrote very poetically. So she said, animated with the firmest zeal for the interest of this country, the peace and union of the American states, and the freedom and happiness of a people who have made the most costly sacrifices in the cause of liberty. Again, pointing right to the revolution and the sacrifices that were made for liberty. She says, who have braved the power of Britain, weathered the convulsions of war, and waded through the blood of friends and foes, to establish their independence and to support the freedom of the human mind. I cannot silently witness this degradation without calling on them before they are compelled to blush at their own servitude and to turn back their languid eyes on their lost liberties, to consider that the character of nations generally changes at the moment of revolution. So she's really highlighting, she's like stirring up emotions, especially for people who lived through the revolution or their family lived through the revolution or lost people through the revolution. Hey, we went through quite a bit. We lost a lot and we sacrificed a great deal for what? And that's what we have to think about. Is liberty the primary object or is it something else? And she continues focusing on the right of self-defense, and she keeps hitting on natural rights, which I think is pretty awesome. She said, self-defense is a primary law of nature, which no subsequent law of society can abolish. And of course, self-defense is not just individual self-defense. It's not just defending your person and your property against maybe criminals down the street. I mean, it's not only self-defense against foreign invasions, but it's also self-defense of people with power in your own governments. And you have to defend yourself against, well, their machinations. And she said, the immediate gift of the Creator. So this right of self-defense, this natural right, this is a gift, but you don't just sit there and not use it. She's saying you gotta stand up for what you believe in. She said, the immediate gift of the Creator obliges everyone to remonstrate against the strides of ambition and a wanton lust of domination, and to resist the first approaches of tyranny. Don't wait until it gets stuck in and try to fix it later on. She was, as we'll see here in this episode, she was not too happy with the Massachusetts ratification, where she was from, Massachusetts ratification of the Constitution, where instead of saying we won't ratify until we get the amendments we want in advance, we'll go ahead and do it on a gentleman's agreement and you will promise to do the right thing later on. She didn't trust that. So she said, you have to resist the first approaches of tyranny. Don't let it gain hold. Take a stand against it now. She said, which at this day threaten to sweep away the rights for which the brave sons of America have fought with a heroism scarcely paralleled even in ancient republic. If you're going to form a system of government, which of course was part of the Lee Resolution in July of 1776, was it June of, well, whenever it passed, it called to create a system of government. It called to create the Declaration of Independence. If you're going to create that based out of, well, we got away from this certain government, you really want to focus on those first principles. And here from Constitution Center, they describe it like this. Warren viewed the Constitution from the perspective of the spirit of 76, the original animating principles of the Revolution, and explained in vivid poetic prose, which you just got a little taste of, hopefully I did it justice, why the proposed system of government posed much the same threat to American liberty as the British government once had. So she would say, like, look, why are we replicating the same thing here? She saw it that way. She said, they write, there was a tragic irony here. As Warren saw it, the same population that had risked their lives to escape distant, centralized tyranny now appeared willing, a mere decade later, to settle for much the same at home.
Professor Ivanovsky, he says the CIA's partnership with Ukraine can be traced back to two phone calls. Now, this actually is from the article. Two phone calls on the night of February 24th, 8 years ago to the day before Russia's full-scale invasion, and it would be literally as the Maidan coup was taking place, as the consolidation of the coup was taking place, the U.S.-backed coup. And the scene setter is millions of Ukrainians had just overrun the country's pro-Kremlin government, and the president, Viktor Yanukovych, and his spy chiefs had fled to Russia. In the tumult, a fragile pro-Western government quickly took power. That's the New York Times wording, fragile, backed by the U.S. So here's the point that the New York Times article is making. The government's new spy chief, Valentin Navalchenko, arrived at the headquarters of the domestic spy agency and found a pile of smoldering documents in the courtyard. Inside, many of the computers had been wiped or were infected with Russian malware. He went to an office and called the CIA station chief and the local head of MI6. It was near midnight, but he summoned them to the building and asked for help to rebuild the agency from the ground up and proposed a three-way partnership. That's how it started, Mr. Navalchenko said. So this brings us back to literally the end of the coup. The coup government sent in someone to run their intel services. His first two phone calls were to CIA and MI6 back in 2014 and said, hey, can you come over here? Can you come help us rebuild the intelligence service? Now, anyone that understands even a little bit about how this works, this means that it brought the entirety of the Ukrainian intelligence services within the fold of the CIA. Essentially, the entirety, the SBU and the rest of the secret services of Ukraine became subcontractors for the CIA. They essentially took over the entire operation. Now, here's something that's even more interesting. If you put this next one on, this is back to a professor from Ottawa. This is a quote from an article. During a previous stint as a spy chief, Mr. Navalchenko started a similar partnership with the CIA, which dissolved when the country swung back toward Russia. Now, this is an important point that may be lost on some people because this takes us back even further than 2014, because that previous stint at spy chief would have been under Yushchenko, who, as you may remember, was put into power after the Orange Revolution in 2004, replacing Yanukovych, who had been elected. So I know it's getting confusing, but Yanukovych was elected president in the early 2000s Ukraine. He was reelected in 2004. The U.S. said this was a fake election. They helped a previous color revolution, the Orange Revolution, take over. They installed Yushchenko in power, and the spy chief under Yushchenko, he immediately started a partnership with the CIA. So this has been a CIA operation well before the 10 years ago after the Maidan. It had happened a lot further than that. So some of the other things, let's go to the next one, because the New York Times article also talks about a network of 12 secret bases that had been built along the Russian border. The CIA built 12 secret bases along the Russian border. The work began 8 years ago. These intelligence bases, from which Russian commanders' communications can be swept up and Russian spy satellites monitored, are being used to launch and track cross-border drone and missile attacks on Russian territory. So the CIA has bases on the border of Russia from which it is coordinating the launch of drone and missile attacks inside of Russia. So go to the next one now, because this is important, I think. This is from the Zero Hedge article. This means that with the disclosure of the long-time closely guarded secret, the world just got a big step closer to World War III. Given it means the CIA is largely responsible for the effectiveness of the recent spate of attacks, which have included direct drone hits on key oil refineries and key infrastructure. So that tells you, can you imagine if the Chinese were operating on our border with Mexico, destroying our petrochemical industry here in the United States, what would be the reaction? Again, referring back to the Chinese balloon we were ready to go to war over. The report emphasizes, but whatever Trump said and did, his administration often went in the other direction. And we talked about this on the Liberty Report over and over. It didn't seem to matter what Trump said. His administration did something different. They did what they wanted to do. Now, going back to the quote, this is because Trump had put Russia hawks in key positions, including Pompeo as CIA director and Bolton as national security advisor. Well, that was a boneheaded thing to do when we talked about it at the time. But this is what they did. They simply ignored their boss. And so here's a further quote. They visited Kiev to underline their full support for this secret partnership, which expanded to include more specialized training programs and the building of additional secret bases. So Trump is getting elected saying, what's wrong with getting along with Russia? Why do we need to provoke Russia? Why do we need a war with Russia? The entire time he's president, his own intelligence community is continuing in expanding a secret war with Russia. Now, you could say it's Trump's fault because he should have got a handle on these people, and that's true. But remember what Schumer said, they have 7 ways from Sunday to get back at you if you tangle with the intelligence community, and that may be part of what's happening. But the other thing that's interesting, though, if you think about that first impeachment, what was Trump impeached for? He was impeached for literally going against the recommendations of the experts in the intelligence community. I think, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, I think Trump knew the gig was up, he knew what was happening, and it was a last-ditch effort to prevent them from doing what they were doing by trying to cancel the assistance to Ukraine, that final assistance, which people like Vindman, a Ukrainian, someone who hates Trump, who was working inside the White House and spilled the beans, blew the whistle, basically made up a bunch of lies about Trump to get him impeached. Trump was trying to go against what the intelligence community was doing in Ukraine, i.e. provoking war with Russia. And for that, he ran up against the third rail. And the third rail is the deep state. And the deep state did his best to take him down. Now, this isn't praise for Trump because he did a lot of terrible and dumb things. However, it just goes to show the extent to which they will go to make sure that U.S. foreign policy is completely aligned with what the deep state wants. And what the deep state wants is war, war, and more war.
For Aristotle, as for Plato, the important issue of politics is what group should have ruling power in the state? What group should be able to control the policies of the state? And in answer to this question, he came up with a sort of mean position, that is, moderate position, as the most practical and stable type of state. He said we don't want one where the few wealthy upper-class aristocrats rule, because this can generate into tyranny or oligarchy. And we don't want one where the masses of poorer people rule, as in democracy, because that becomes unlimited mob rule, and that's hopeless. Both Plato and Aristotle were staunch opponents of the idea of unlimited mob rule. Rather, said Aristotle, the best state is a cross between rule of the rich and of the poor, rule of the few and of the many, a state ruled neither by the mob nor by an elite of experts, but by an intermediate class, what we today call the middle class, you see. A state such as this Aristotle called a polity, P-O-L-I-T-Y, and he advocated it as the best, most practical constitution. In other words, a large middle class should hold the balance of power and act as a check on the, what today would be called the proletariat on the bottom, and the few potentially tyrannical aristocrats at the top. So there is a definite sense in which Aristotle differs from Plato's totalitarian philosopher-king theory. And as I mentioned, Aristotle objects to Plato's communism, but in very, very mixed and rather feeble terms. Remember, Plato objected to mine and thine. Well, Aristotle says mine and thine are inherent in human nature. You only create conflicts and resentments if you try to communize property and families. Better to leave people private property and encourage them to develop a community spirit voluntarily, so they'll share with others voluntarily. Now, to this audience, such an answer speaks for itself. It is not a very powerful answer to Plato. However, I should point out that even though Aristotle allows the citizens of his state to have much more say than Plato does, Aristotle's state, as he describes it, also inclines in the direction of being an aristocracy run by a comparative few, even if not in nearly so pronounced a form as Plato's. For instance, Aristotle, and Plato, I should say, and the Greeks in general advocated slavery. They had no concept of inalienable rights. They argued, Aristotle argued, for instance, and I stress again, he did not originate this view, nor was he distinctive in holding. But he argued that there were natural slaves, men who had the capacity to understand a rational argument, but not to exercise reason independently, who were in effect living tools. And he said it would be to their own benefit and to the benefit of a master if they serve and work a natural master. In other words, those in whom theoretical reason is fully developed. Because the slave gains the benefit of contact with a fully rational man who directs him, and the rational man, exempt from the need for menial work, has the leisure for contemplation. Now, this is an obvious gross flaw in Aristotle's view, but I stress it is not a flaw in his ethics or philosophy. It is a flaw in his anthropology. That is to say, in his view of mankind, and a flaw which he shared with the Greeks in general. The Greeks never really grasped, at least not until the time of the Stoics, a later school, that human beings, all human beings, are metaphysically equal. The Greeks of the classical period all held that men are divided into the metaphysical superiors and the metaphysical inferiors, one destined to rule the other. This is an error, but it is an error in their theory of the nature of man, not an error in their ethics. Their ethical error is simply a consequence of it. And they had some provocation for it. They were the only civilization. Around them was not another civilized world, but a world of crude, ignorant barbarians. And at that stage of the game, if you lived in Greece, you had a certain warrant for looking around you and saying, we are human and the aliens are simply savages. I may point out that Aristotle also excluded women from citizenship in his state. Not only slaves, but also women, on the grounds that they were metaphysically inferior, a ground, again, equally invalid, but equally warranted by a study of the women in his purview. He goes so far as to build this into his metaphysics in a doctrine which has no importance at all, but he says, for instance, that in conception, when men and women unite to produce a child, the woman contributes the matter, the low element, and the man contributes the forms. I may say, to be accurate, that on this one point, Plato was ahead of Aristotle. He recognized the metaphysical equality of women with men. Aristotle did not. Also, in his capacity as a Platonist, Aristotle generally scorned tradesmen, mechanics, that type of person, and he says that life is, quote, ignoble and inimical to virtue. And they too are to be deprived of citizenship or any active participation in the state. That's simply the equivalent of Plato's view that the productive group is out of the state, or is in a servile position. You see from these few points that there's a heavy Platonic influence in Aristotle's politics. There is not much of great value in it, and I do not want to pursue it further now.
New York Times had a big report that came out on Sunday detailing the CIA support for Ukraine over the years. And it said that the CIA helped build 12 secret spy bases in Ukraine along the Russian border as part of the agency's support for Ukrainian intelligence that started in 2014. So that's 10 years ago. And this report described one of the CIA-built spy bases as an underground bunker used by Ukrainian soldiers to track Russian spy satellites and eavesdrop on conversations between Russian commanders. So this report sheds new light on the CIA's involvement in Ukraine, which played a major role in provoking the Russian invasion. A European official told the paper that when Russian President Vladimir Putin was considering invading Ukraine toward the end of 2021, the head of one of Russia's main spy services told him that the CIA and the UK's MI6 were controlling Ukraine and turning it into a beachhead for operations against Moscow. The report said that the CIA's relationship with Ukrainian intelligence could be traced back to February 24th, 2014. That's just a day or two after former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych was ousted in a U.S.-backed coup. On that day, the new head of the Security Service of Ukraine, that's the SBU, that was appointed by the post-coup government, got on the phone and asked the CIA for help in rebuilding Ukraine's intelligence capabilities. And the CIA agreed to help as it saw an opportunity to collect more intelligence on Russia. The U.S. spy agency helped form the 5th Directorate in the SBU, which is a new unit within the SBU, and it's interesting. Apparently, it consisted of young Ukrainians who were born after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the idea was that the CIA was concerned that the SBU was full of, Ukrainians who were sympathetic to the Russians. So they wanted younger guys, who didn't live under the Soviet Union. So the Washington Post first reported on the CIA's creation of this 5th Directorate back in October 2023. So it was a very similar report. This New York Times one has some new details about these spy bases, but both, detail this CIA support for Ukraine's intelligence services that goes back 10 years ago. And the Washington Post report said that the CIA had spent tens of millions of dollars to transform Ukraine's They spent tens of millions of dollars to transform Ukraine's Soviet-formed services into potent allies against Moscow. The CIA has also supported Ukraine's military intelligence agency, known as the GUR. And the GUR provided an opportunity for the U.S. because this report said it was allowed to collect intelligence outside of Ukraine, meaning that it could be used inside Russia. And a former U.S. intelligence official, this is going back to the Washington Post report again, this official described the GUR as our little baby. So the New York Times report said that the CIA started training Ukrainian spies who have operated inside Russia, across Europe, in Cuba, and in other places where Russians have a large presence. The CIA also helped create an elite commando unit known as Unit 2245, which collected Russian drones and other technology so that the U.S. could reverse engineer them. And one member of this commando unit was Kyrylo Budanov, who now heads the GUR. He is the head of Ukraine's military intelligence. They quote a guy named Ivan Bakanov, who was the head of the SBU when Russia first invaded. He basically credited the CIA support for Ukraine being able to put up any kind of fight. He said, without the CIA, quote, there would have been no way for us to resist the Russians or to beat them, end quote. So, you always hear about how the invasion was unprovoked, and then you see this stuff coming out. And then another story that came out in recent years, I think this was actually before Russia invaded, Yahoo News reported that starting in 2014 when the Donbass war broke out, that the CIA deployed operators to basically to the front lines of the war. So we've known for a long time that the CIA has been deeply involved in Ukraine since that coup in 2014. Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico warned on Monday that some NATO and EU countries are considering sending troops to Ukraine, a step that would risk direct war between NATO and Russia. So Fico said, quote, several NATO and EU member states are considering sending their soldiers to Ukraine on a bilateral basis, end quote. And remember, he's saying this as someone who was opposed to this, who was opposed to the proxy war. He was elected last year, and he ran on a platform of cutting off aid to Ukraine. So some NATO members have been signing their own security deals, bilateral security deals with Ukraine. I know Germany and the UK have done this already, but there's no indication that sending troops is part of that. Fico said, quote, we see huge security risks in the bilateral agreements that are likely to be conducted soon with NATO and EU member states that want to send their troops to Ukraine, end quote. So Sweden cleared its last hurdle to join NATO on Monday as Hungary's parliament ratified its membership. Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson, celebrated this the approval here, and now Sweden is going to formally join NATO once it submits its instrument of accession with the U.S. government. But this was the last thing that they needed. Hungary was the last holdout. Turkey held out for a long time and approved Sweden's NATO bid last month. So now Hungary has followed them, and Hungary delayed its vote on Sweden's NATO bid over Stockholm's criticism of the Hungarian government of Viktor Orban. And this is something, a lot of EU countries criticize Hungary. Orban met with Kristersson this past Friday, and that they agreed that they've rebuilt trust. And Orban also acknowledged that being members of NATO means that we are prepared to die for each other. So they worked it out or whatever, and Hungary approved it. And now Sweden joining NATO brings the total number of members of the alliance to 32, and that is double how many countries were in NATO when the Soviet Union collapsed. So they've doubled in size since the end of the Cold War.
Take a listen to what President Macron said over the weekend. It's a short clip, and the key phrase, the key words are the last 3 or 4 that he uses.
There is no consensus today to send ground troops in an official, endorsed and sanctioned manner, but in dynamic terms, nothing should be ruled out.
But in dynamic terms, nothing should be ruled out. So you have the Prime Minister of Great Britain making noises. You have the President of France talking about it. You have the general belief in Europe that Poland and the Polish leaders and Zelensky have entered into some kind of non-public agreement. You have the New York Times acknowledging that the CIA has built 12 stations in Ukraine, that American intelligence is helping Ukraine troops aim equipment into Russia. This is being done with American equipment and American ammunition. All of this together. Is the U.S. starting a war with Russia?
Well, we are fighting a war with Russia, proxy war, of course, but the sudden discussion of these troops, particularly with Macron, French soldiers, either past or present, we're not sure, were killed not too long ago in Ukraine. And Russia accused and actually sent his ambassador in Paris to talk to them about this. He said, you've got French people fighting in, is this a government sanctioned fighting against us here? And of course, Macron denied it. Now you've got Great Britain, maybe this idea, this planted article, the CIA, all this CIA activity in Ukraine. I think they are preparing for deaths of Americans, deaths of French soldiers, possible deaths of MI6 or other UK soldiers. I think they're preparing for a publication of that because I think it's going to happen. I think they're already there. I don't see this because, like you pointed out, who has the soldiers to do this? Certainly not the UK. The French will not tolerate it. The French have so many issues already with Macron. They're not going to tolerate that. So, and the US isn't going to do it except through CIA or secret type thing. But I think they're going to find some Americans, they're going to find some British soldiers, they're going to find some French soldiers and some others in Ukraine fighting against the Russians. And they are trying to set the stage to get ahead of that story. That's what I suspect. I don't think we're going to fight directly with Russia because look what they just did to the M1 Abrams. I mean, this is not fun for Americans. It's not fun for the British. It's not fun for France or Germany for that matter.
Last question or last observation from you, and on a different subject matter, but again, this will raise your blood pressure. President or Prime Minister Netanyahu over the weekend on one of the talk shows gave that standard defense that he always gives. What would America do if this large a percentage of its population had been killed? If instead of 3,000 Americans on 9/11, it had been 10,000. I would argue we wouldn't be slaughtering innocents. But you take a listen to what he says and tell me if you think he speaks truthfully when he says the IDF is careful when it targets people that it kills. Number 6, Chris.
Yeah. What would America do, Margaret, if you faced the equivalent of 20 9/11s, 50,000 Americans slaughtered in one day, 10,000 Americans, including mothers and children, held hostage? Would you not be doing what Israel is doing? You'd be doing a hell of a lot more. And all Americans that I talk to, nearly all say that. So Israel has gone to extraordinary lengths, calling up people, civilians, Palestinians in Gaza, telling them, leave your home, sending pamphlets. We have done that effort. Hamas tries to keep them at gunpoint. We'll clear them out of harm's way. We'll complete the job and achieve total victory, which is necessary to give a secure future for Israel, a better future for Gaza, a better future for the Middle East, and a setback for the Iran terror axis. That's in all our interest. It's in America's interest, too.
We will clear people, civilians, Palestinians out of harm's way. This is more of a bald-faced lie than what you just analyzed from Mrs. Newland. The only thing the IDF is careful about is killing any Palestinian that moves in Gaza.
That's right. And the better future for Gaza is a future of 100% Israeli settlements, with a few Palestinians left to maintain the swimming pools and the yards and the gardens. That is the vision that they have. And if the United States had a situation like that, where we had our sights set on taking over the territory of another country, a long-term plan of doing that, and a history of decades of development of American hatred for a particular ethnic group, promoted in our schools and through generations. If we were in that situation, we might act like Israel, but we're not, and we wouldn't. We don't even, we can't even tolerate we have got Julian Assange in jail for, we want to cat him. Why? Because he embarrassed us over the killing that our soldiers have done of a handful of innocent people compared to what Israel has done. We don't, in this country, we don't want to be embarrassed by it, and we are, as a people, embarrassed by it. So he's not only lying, he's wrong, and he's making assumptions that are actually insulting to the American population and to the American government. So, he's a vicious person, and unfortunately for him, he's not going to escape his fate.
Good friend of ours and a good friend of Liberty, visiting here in Lake Jackson, Lou Rockwell. Lou, good to have you with us.
Great to be with you, sir. It's an honor.
Very good. I hear that you have another book out, and it'll just short time ago, right? And it's it's available on LouRockwell.com. Tell us about that book.
It's called Against the Left, and it's got an introduction by Hans Hermann Hoppe.
Oh.
And in there, I talk about the ideas of Mises and Rothbard, their cultural ideas. I mean, for example, both of them were very much in favor of traditional families, whereas the left, of course, hates the traditional family. Marx wanted to abolish it, and he's certainly not the only one. I talk about egalitarianism. The left, of course, wants everybody to be forcibly made equal. That's actually impossible, but because it is impossible, it gives them sort of a carte blanche to do whatever they want to do. And I talk about the fact that in human history, the left has been the most violent, the most evil, far more so than the right. Just take the 20th century, communism, National Socialism. These organizations and these ideas were responsible for the most deaths ever. Maybe Genghis Khan or whatever, I guess, was pretty bad too, but he wasn't either a rightist or a leftist in our terms.
Mm-hmm.
But the left, beginning, say, in the French Revolution, which was extremely violent, very bloodthirsty, and had a lot to do with spreading leftist ideas. And I think it's important to realize they are our enemy. They're the most violent, the most nasty bunch that we have to face. And we see it right now with Antifa. And I think a lot of these Democratic political candidates are very pro-violence. They would, of course, claim they're not. But as you pointed out, a guy like Bernie Sanders is a very violent guy. I mean, he's not a peaceful guy. He's no Ron Paul. People try to compare the two of you, but he's no Ron Paul. So I think it's important to understand why the left is our enemy. My last book was called Against the State. And, of course, the state is the ultimate enemy, but the left are the people who promote the state the most, and it's the most destructive force in human society.
It was said back during the Depression, and as the stock market crashed and all, Roosevelt ran on a very conservative platform, balance the budget, the gold standard, and all these things.
Yeah, going to cut the number of bureaucrats.
And he knew what he was doing because the people superficially still identified with that and had to do it. But others, and I think you have pointed out, the universities were full of lefties already. So the ideological fight was being fought in a silent way. And Roosevelt was influenced, and others were, and actually that's where policy came from. But hopefully we're seeing the reverse of that. But it has to be modified a little bit, because we can't sit back and say, oh yes, the universities are producing sound economic thinkers, but fortunately we have access to people through the internet.
That's right.
And so therefore a lot of people can be exposed, and they're sort of anonymous. We don't know where they are. But one question I want to ask you about this, you might have a feel for it, is basically libertarians don't like the state and the state universities, and they have all these problems and going on. Mm-hmm. But we have some who are good libertarians that have actually, gotten involved in a government school. Is that just a couple people, or are there more people involved there than we realize? And would that necessarily be anything bad? It seems to me like if they're able to survive it, maybe they can influence somebody even in a government school.
Well, I think that's right, and I think there are many of them in public schools and in junior colleges and four-year colleges, universities. There are a lot. So that's a good thing. And why leave that to just the communists? Why shouldn't our people be involved? So that But on the other hand, there are a lot of colleges and universities that are just entirely left-wing, and they will punish anybody with our ideas. They're not just satisfied to shut you up and give you a bad grade, but they would do other things to students.
Demagogues are out there. 99% of the ordinary media support all that mess, and they're part of it. And the deep state is, although they say the deep state is becoming more apparent and we're understanding it, no, they just have a deeper state, the buried state. But there are people there, at least trying to pull strings. But I believe ideas are very, very powerful, and they can be counteracted. And if they're based in challenges in a nonviolent manner, I think it's a powerful weapon, and I still am convinced that most people don't like war, and I think peace candidates generally do pretty well. And my analogy is how many times did it happen where the young people of the United States, the 18 to 24-year-olds, got together and they have their organization, and they say, things have been pretty quiet here for a couple decades. We've never had a chance to go to war. And they call up some people in Iran, and they say, how often have you guys had a fight? Oh, well, we have a club here. They're 18 to 24, and they'd like to have a war too. So the young people communicate, and they say, well, let's fight over religion or something. We'll fight over something. Never. Obviously, it's a ridiculous thing to say. It always comes from top down, and the victims, and the ones who now, one of the worst group of people are the chicken hawks. And I ran into a lot of those in Washington, who got 5 deferments, and did they become peace-loving people, which we would be very happy to join us? No. What they do is they send somebody else's kids off to war. That's the kind of thing that people should respond to, the immorality of a system like that.
Well, it's true, and that's one of the aspects of Austrian economics. Teaches you that social cooperation is the greatest thing that comes out of the free market. That people are able to help each other, to profit by helping each other, and it's a tremendous thing. Whereas, Franklin Roosevelt, we were talking about a little bit before, brought a horrible socialist fascist system in, and I think it was no coincidence that when Keynes published his general theory in German, that he praised Hitler for putting his own theories, for putting Keynes's theories into practice. So those are the kinds of people that we face. They're the enemies that we face, but we've got the truth on our side. So that's in the end the far more valuable thing.
I think your point of cooperation, that's what solves so many problems. And to me, the problems aren't that difficult if you're responsible for figuring out an answer rather than saying I'm entitled to somebody taking care of me. But that also brings up the term that a lot of people use, and I like, and that's voluntarism. Everything should be voluntary. I mean, what a peaceful world it would be if nobody can do anything to anybody else, they can't take their property, it has to be voluntary, and a lot of problems would be solved. We will need to close now, Lou, but just tell the audience one more time about your book and where to go to buy your new book.
It's called Against the Left. You can go to, I hope not before too much longer, it'll be on Amazon. But right now you can go to LouRockwell.com and look at the store, and it's available right there.
Now let's sum up Aristotle as a whole. In looking at his overall philosophy, you can point out many errors and many bad points. To review a few, his inadequate account of sense perception, his inadequate account at many points of the nature of mind, his doctrine of God, of teleology, of contingency, of prime matter, of the golden mean, of contemplation as an end in itself, his deficient politics, etc., etc. Now, all of this you must know if, as students of objectivism, you claim any kind of affiliation with Aristotle, because these are facts, and in conversations people will confront you with them, and you will be amazed at what Aristotle could say. But in the process of inventorying his bad points, I ask that you not forget what he did achieve and in what context. Starting from a culture in which there were only Platonists and Sophists, Aristotle laid down the basic principles of a scientific epistemology: the role of the senses, the role of abstraction, the laws of logic, the types of reasoning, the basic rules of validity in deductive reasoning. He laid down the principles of a naturalistic, this-worldly metaphysics, one reality, a world of particulars, of entities acting in accordance with their natures, lawful, intelligible, graspable by man. And in ethics, the principles of a this-worldly ethics, according to which man's goal is to achieve personal happiness and personal pride by exercising his intellectual powers to the fullest. On these topics, Aristotle did not say the last word. But as I have observed, he often said the first of any value. The pro-reason, pro-life, pro-this-world approach to philosophy, in its essence and at root, is the creation of Aristotle. And it is for that we owe him a debt of gratitude, no matter how great his other errors and Platonic carryovers.
So a new poll from Data for Progress has found that about 2/3 of American voters support the idea of the U.S. pushing for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, an idea that is opposed by the Biden administration. So when asked if they support the U.S. calling for a permanent ceasefire and a general de-escalation of violence, 67% of respondents said that they did, and that includes 77% of Democrats, 69% of independents, and 56% of Republicans. That means the majority of Republicans are saying the U.S. should call for a permanent ceasefire. And the support for a permanent ceasefire increased by 6 points since Data for Progress conducted the same poll, asked the same question. That was conducted at the end of November. So the support for a ceasefire is increasing. And throughout this conflict, throughout the Israeli massacre of Palestinians in Gaza, since the very beginning, since right after October 7th, the polling has consistently shown that the majority of Americans favor a ceasefire. So President Biden said on Monday that a hostage deal between Israel and Hamas was close and that he hoped a ceasefire could be reached by Monday, March 4th. But in response, both sides indicated that an agreement is still far away and said the president spoke too soon. So according to the Times of Israel, one Hamas official said that Biden's comments were premature and didn't reflect reality. Another Hamas official told Reuters that there was still big gaps between the two sides, and that's because Hamas is still saying that they're looking for a permanent ceasefire, the withdrawal of Israeli troops. A second Hamas official said, speaking to Reuters, said, quote, "The primary and main issues of the ceasefire and the withdrawal of Israeli forces are not clearly stated, which delays reaching an agreement," end quote. So Biden's comments came as a surprise to Israeli officials. And reports said that Netanyahu himself was surprised and that these comments were not made in coordination with the Israeli government. Israeli officials are blaming the lack of an agreement on Hamas's demands, although they're also saying that Netanyahu is complicating the negotiations by adding demands himself. There was a report from Haaretz on Monday that said he was saying the Palestinian prisoners who are being released should be deported to Turkey or Qatar or another third country. And again, I just mentioned that Netanyahu is making very clear any ceasefire is temporary. So NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said on Tuesday that the alliance has no plans to send combat troops to Ukraine after French President Emmanuel Macron stirred an uproar by saying that the idea of deploying troops should not be ruled out. So Stoltenberg told the Associated Press, quote, "NATO allies are providing unprecedented support to Ukraine. We have done that since 2014 and stepped up after the full-scale invasion, but there are no plans for combat troops on the ground in Ukraine," end quote. So in response to Macron's comments, the Kremlin said that a deployment of Western troops to Ukraine would make a direct Russia-NATO war inevitable. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, quote, "In this case, we need to talk not about probability, but about the inevitability of conflict," end quote. And so that was Russia's comment, was this would mean war. This would mean direct war. And that means, likely nuclear war. How quickly would a direct war between Russia and NATO turn into nuclear war? That's something we don't want to find out. Then Ukraine's response, they were celebrating this talk of NATO sending troops to Ukraine. This is Ukrainian presidential advisor Mikhailo Podolyak. He said, quote, "This shows, firstly, an absolute awareness of the risks posed to Europe by a militaristic, aggressive Russia," end quote. So some NATO leaders, after Macron's comments, they kind of distanced themselves from the idea of sending combat troops to Ukraine. Poland, Germany, there's a few other countries, I believe the Czech Republic, and the U.S. all came out and said, we don't plan on sending troops. And again, they're talking about, I guess, combat troops or, large numbers of troops for training. Because people probably forget that there was confirmation that there is NATO Special Operations Forces on the ground, even though less than 100, still, that's a potential tripwire for war. Who knows what. There's just always that risk of escalation here. But this article is from Middle East Eye, and it says that the Biden administration came under fire from lawmakers on Tuesday over the lack of congressional approval to conduct military strikes against Yemen's Houthis and defend foreign ships in the Red Sea. Chris Murphy, who's a senator from Connecticut, he's a Democrat, he said, quote, "There is no existing law that would permit military action against the Houthis. For the military campaign to continue, I believe that a tailored, time-bound congressional authorization isn't just nice to have, it is required," end quote. And he was talking about introducing an authorization, so instead of just opposing this thing, he's saying, well, maybe we should give you the authorization here. So according to this story, the U.S. and the U.K. have hit over 230 Houthi targets in Yemen, and they've, it goes to show how much they have been bombing the country. And I saw Tim Kaine, who is the senator from Virginia, Democrat. He was grilling one of the U.S. officials at this hearing about this idea that, because this started in defense of foreign ships. The Houthis started attacking British and American commercial ships after the U.S. and the U.K. started this bombing campaign. So Kane basically said, there's no argument here because they're calling it self-defense. Whenever they put out these press releases, they call them self-defense strikes. And Kane was basically saying that there's no possible argument that defending foreign commercial shipping is self-defense. So, because when they say it's self-defense, that means they're trying to cite Article 2 of the Constitution. So, he's just saying that that's completely ridiculous on the face of it.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
And your new Trends Journal's out, and here's the cover. Here it is. Trump, Biden, and Congress. Genocide's okay. It's the Israeli way. Don't believe me? How about them? Look at this genocide going on in front of everybody's eyes. I'm heartbroken about this. I cry about it. I have nightmares about it. And just to say that it's not bullshit what that cover says, and it's bullshit spewing out of their mouths. This is Trump in October, last October. So I fought for Israel like no president ever before. Oh, you fought? You got a big mouth, fat boy, but you can't fight. You're just full of shit like all the rest of them. Trump goes on. Like no president ever before, recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital. He goes on. And even recognized Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights? Fuck you. They stole this land. Something that they never even thought. We gave that to them. We, not we, you. Oh, and by the way, fat mouth, and I'll call that to your face. Fat mouth. You got $100 million from Sheldon Adelson. Joe Biden. Again, look at your cover. Trump, Biden, and Congress. Genocide's okay. It's the Israeli way. Biden. When he went to see Benjamin murderer Netanyahu in late October, right after Trump said this. He said, I don't believe you have to be, I don't believe you have to be a Jew to be a Zionist, and I'm a Zionist. Hey, fuckface, dumber than shit, can't walk in a straight line. How about being an American? What the fuck are we fighting a religious war for? Oh, I know. Save your shit with the chosen people, all right? God created us all equal, got it? This war is only going to escalate. Hey, did you see oil prices today? Yep. Back up to $83 a barrel for Brent crude. And now Russia and OPEC are saying they're going to be cutting back on production. And now they're ramping up the war, bombs away over Lebanon, hitting eastern Lebanon, and ramping it up with Iran. If Iran gets involved in this war, you're going to see oil prices go to over $130 a barrel. It's going to crash the global economy and crash equity markets. But won't you be happy that Trump fought for Israel like no president ever before, and the fuckface who says he's a Catholic, an Irish Catholic, says he is a Zionist. So fuck everybody else. Let them kill whoever they want. And when you're paying more for the pump, don't forget, thank Biden, Trump, and Congress. Again, you look at what's going on. They had this guy on Fox today from the JP Morgan Chase Bankster gang. Yeah, the company that's convicted of 5 felonies. 5 felonies. And he said we're going to likely enter into a economic climate of stagflation, stagnant economy and rising inflation. Got it wrong. Read our top trends. Dragflation. Dragflation. The economy is going to go down and inflation is going up. About 70 million Americans exposed to toxic forever chemicals. Isn't that nice? All the lousy crap that, you're worried about climate change? How about all the fucking poisons they're putting in all our food? I know, you like those ultra-processed foods. Iran calls out U.S. hypocrisy after leader removed from Facebook and Instagram. Yep, one thing after another. Putin kept pushing for ceasefire in Donbass in 2019, but Zelensky rejected it. This is the clown boy. Again, that's caught. You could Google it up. Puts Zelensky playing the piano with his penis. This is the president of Ukraine. His former top job was a sitcom comedian. He sold himself as a peace candidate, never having an intention to have peace. Lied to the people, just like in America with the Nobel Peace of Crap Prize winner Barack Obama, who sold himself as a peace candidate. As soon as he gets elected, it's the Afghan troop surge with another arrogant fucking prick that betray us. Oh, yeah, he's working for one of the big firms now. Yeah. Going to Afghanistan. Oh, yeah, we're going to win. You guys haven't won a fucking war since World War II. And the only reason you won World War II is the Russians, who have been taught to hate. They were the first ones to defeat Germany. After 25 million of them or more were killed by Germans in Operation Barbarossa. So you got political shitheads running the world, and that's why you need your T-shirt. Hey, politicians, who the fuck are you to tell me what to do?
What actually happened was Manning was ordered to help process the arrest and imprisonment of a guy who had written an article critical of Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki and calling him a thief. It was called "Where Did the Money Go?" And he was sure to be tortured and maybe killed. And Manning said to Bradley Manning said to his superior officer, "Hey, what is this? I don't want to do this. This is wrong. What the hell?" And was told, "Get back to work." And that was the motive. And Manning explained that to the rat in the private messages when, assuming no one else was looking, and that it was a private message because the guy had said, "I'm a priest and a journalist, or a reverend and a journalist, so I can doubly keep your secrets. Don't worry, you can trust me." And he explained, Chelsea Manning, explained the purpose of the whole thing. So sorry to go on like that, but that was what it was. It wasn't Julian Assange came from somehow just picked a random army specialist and twisted his arm behind his back.
Yeah, that's a very important point. So the arguments that they're trying to make to the judge is like, look, you have, there's jurisprudence, right, precedent from the European Court of Human Rights, which is supposed to be the highest court on human rights issues. And they're very clear that when it comes to publication, there's a balancing test that must be done. And they say that the judge, at first instance, District Judge Vanessa Breitzer, when she ruled against all the defense arguments, and she said these are matters that can be raised at trial, but they can't be because there's no public interest defense under the Espionage Act, right? They said that she failed in her responsibilities, right? Because it's an appellate court, so you're having to make grounds of law, right? Those are where your main arguments are. So their main arguments were, if you like, almost a fact. So the U.S. government saying harm has occurred, etc. And they're saying, look, the European Court would say balance on the one hand, potential alleged unproven harm on the one hand, versus verifiable fact of torture, rape, assassinations, drone strikes, right? Like we know for a fact that courts, including the European Court itself, has found that as a result of WikiLeaks disclosures, cases succeeded, including the case of Khalid al-Masri, who testified on behalf of Julian Assange about how he was kidnapped by the CIA, rendered, tortured, because they mistook him for someone else for months. And even when they realized he was the wrong person, they kept him for, I think, a couple more months. And then dumped him out of a van in some random country. And he had to find his way home. And his family, he was on holiday. His family were back in Lebanon because they're like, our dad and husband has disappeared. And this poor guy, this poor German Lebanese, I think, German Lebanese citizen, ended up having to bring this case. And it's only because of WikiLeaks disclosures that came to light and he was able to win a judgment at the European Court.
And I'm sorry, Mohammed, we're so short on time, but just on that point, there are at least 10,000 news stories, certainly high thousands and thousands of news stories that at least in part cite the WikiLeaks cables, the State Department cables, the Iraq-Afghan war logs, the Guantanamo files. There's no question about the newsworthy public interest data in this stuff. And it's actually because it's all secret and confidential level stuff. So it didn't cause any spies to get rolled up behind Russian lines or anything like that. Just told the truth that people deserve to know. And then, but on the last thing here before we go, and I'm really late, so if you can, as fast as you can you talk about this argument by these barristers, again, representing the United States, that the First Amendment doesn't apply here. Their power to prosecute Assange applies, but for whatever reason, and it sounds like the way you covered it here, doesn't sound like the defense attorney didn't have a straight argument either about, look, if they're putting their hands on him, that makes him a U.S. person, and then you're damn right he's got the First Amendment, which is the correct argument.
Well, yeah. So the defense are saying, look, Mike Pompeo, when he was CIA director, said that the First Amendment does not apply to him because he's not a U.S. person, he's not a U.S. citizen, even though they are seeking to apply domestic criminal law against him for actions that he took based outside of the United States. And bear in mind, Chelsea Manning, as you said, was based in Iraq. So they're applying domestic criminal, over 100-year-old espionage law against a non-U.S. person while saying that the First Amendment protections do not apply to him. And so therefore, they're saying that this would breach his rights under freedom of speech and press that he has here. He'd get this would be discrimination according to nationality, which is in violation of the extradition treaty, right, which bars extradition to a place where someone would face discrimination, disfavorable treatment as a result of race, religion, etc., political opinion, and nationality. And they also say that this would violate his rights under the Human Rights Act and the European Convention of Human Rights, which afford protections of freedom of speech and the press. And when one of the judges asked one of the American lawyers, or the lawyers representing the United States, do we have any evidence before us that a foreign citizen like Assange would have protections under the First Amendment that would have to be taken into consideration? And actually, the barrister representing the United States, or one of them, said, in short, no. Right. So in short, they accepted that position, but it wasn't completely clear. And they said, OK, we want you to go and find out, go through all the documents that have been submitted in this case and come back to us with an answer if there's like a concrete answer. Because Gordon Kronberg, the U.S. prosecutor, had also said in his statements, which have made their way into the courts because he's one of the lead U.S. prosecutors in this case, that if Julian tries to raise a First Amendment argument in the United States, they would have the ability to raise the argument that First Amendment doesn't apply to him because he's not a U.S. person, right, and not a U.S. resident. Yeah. So it is fascinating.
That's the rule of law there. They just have to have it both ways, right? They can prosecute them, but they don't have to abide by the restrictions on the limitations of their power to persecute them. It's completely crazy.
Here's a letter that she wrote to John Adams. There's tons of letters between her and John Adams. There was a time where they were apart for a very long period, maybe almost a decade. So they wrote quite a bit. And she was very influential, Mrs. President. Here she is writing to John Adams in 1797 about her absolute hatred for Alexander Hamilton, or maybe we don't call it hatred because that wouldn't have fit with her moral character, but certainly she thought he was very evil. And here's how she put it. I have read his heart in his wicked eyes many a time. The very devil is in them. Now, she was a very fierce advocate for independence. We often call John Adams the Atlas of independence. He was the hothead. He was impatient, but he was not impatient enough for Abigail Adams. She kept pushing him. I'll get to that in a moment. She warned that power always grows. She repeatedly pushed for the advancement of women, not equality in the more modern woke sense, but advancement, especially in education. She was an early opponent of slavery, a strong supporter of education, and she was actually an arms manufacturer too, at least ammunition. I thought that was interesting as well. So let's get through some of these quotes that I think are really interesting. She says, power, whether vested in many or a few, is ever grasping, and like the grave, cries, give, give. This is always a quote that I use or I cite when I'm citing the founding generation on the maxim that power always grows. Power, no matter who has it, will always seek to expand. It is part of the flawed part of human nature. These are maxims of human nature. She said, the great fish swallow up the small, and he who is most strenuous for the rights of the people when vested with power is as eager after the prerogatives of government. And in essence, if we read it, out of context here, we could say this is kind of a warning about what her and her husband did when they got in power, because certainly John Adams, her husband, and her, they were very fierce advocates for liberty at the time when this was written, certainly in 1775, the Atlas of Independence, natural rights and things like that. But then once in power and office, all of a sudden, liberty of the press meant the central government could have power over the press or determine what is considered liberty or not. So when people have power, they tend to, it doesn't matter how good they were when they didn't have power, they always seek to expand that power. So don't trust anyone with power, including the people who tell you don't trust anyone with power. Here's a letter to her son, John Quincy Adams, in November of 1776, again, talking about power and tyranny and how things grow. She said, for the experience of ages and the historic page teach us that a popular tyranny never fails to be followed by the arbitrary government of a single person. So when the popular will establishes, this is two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner, when the popular will establishes a tyranny over the minority, it's always going to eventually lead, according to her, to a arbitrary government of a single person. An arbitrary government is one of those things that we call a grievance. So they're really the injuries and usurpations. They were listed in the Declaration of Independence. An arbitrary government is that just can do whatever it wants at its whim, as long as it has the power to do so, the will to do so. There are no rules for government whatsoever. As I mentioned, she was a very strong advocate for independence. Here she is in October of 1774. I mean, they weren't really pushing for this at this point. There was a lot of talk about reconciliation. And she said to her husband, John, we have too many high-sounding words and too few actions that correspond with them. And you can take that very broadly as well, especially in her views on slavery, which I'll get to in a few minutes as well, that if you're going to talk about liberty and freedom, you're not really following through in the way that it sure sounds to be. And here's a letter to Catherine Sawbridge Macaulay in the fall of 1774. I couldn't find an exact date on this one. It's not even listed on the date here at founders.archives.gov, but it's somewhere in the fall. She said, the cause of America, a cause, madam, which has now become so serious to every American that we consider it as a struggle from which we shall obtain a release from our present bondage by an ample redress of our grievances or a redress by the sword. The only alternative which every American thinks of is liberty or death. We often attribute liberty or death to our great friends in the Free State, but certainly others were using this type of terminology, this type of phrase. Here's Abigail Adams here in the fall of 1774, before the shot heard around the world, saying this is, of course, in response to the hated coercive acts, what they call the intolerable acts, and they were certainly doing some gun control there, ramping up to Lexington and Concord in 1775. And she's already pointing out, like, look, either they got to back down or we're going to fight them off. This is liberty or death. There's nothing else at all. And she wanted to see an educated society. She pointed out that just being spoon-fed education is not really education. And that's how a vast majority of people do things today. Oh, I've gone through my government-run schools, and I've just learned the stuff that they taught me. And it's really, they create... The government schools never teach people how to limit government power. They only teach people that government is the solution to all problems, generally most of which were caused by government, but they don't teach you that either. So if you just sit there and just take the spoon-fed education, you're not really educated. You're just becoming a tool of the state, a victim of propaganda. And Abigail Adams, I think, understood this type of thing all the way back in 1780 into a letter to her son, John Quincy. I can't remember when he was born. Maybe he was like 12 or 15, something. He was pretty young at this point. She said, learning is not attained by chance. It must be sought for with ardor and attended to with diligence. And I think that's kind of, it's not necessarily a motto for this show, but this is certainly what we do here. Like, I learn as I go on almost every single episode. As I put together the notes for these episodes, you would be surprised. I don't know all this stuff off the top of my head every single time. Sometimes I can rip through it pretty well or speak off the cuff, but I have to kind of organize it. And sometimes as I'm going through it, I'm like, oh, I should look into this. Is there any quote on this? Or is there any counterpoint on this? And I'm always doing a couple of hours of research for almost every single episode. Some of them are a little quicker than others, but some of them a little longer. So I'm learning as I go as well. And I think the only reason you're interested in this is because you want to learn what I'm learning as well. And that's how we kind of expand our knowledge, learn about our founding principles, and learn how to put them into practice today. We have to search out our education with ardor, and we have to attend to it with diligence. She pointed out the hypocrisy of speaking about freedom for all and not really putting it into practice because other human beings were not in that same state. Here in a letter to John Adams, 1774, she said, I wish most sincerely that there was not a slave in the province. They did exist in the North, despite the fact that some people want to just blame the South for this kind of thing. It always appeared a most iniquitous scheme to me. Fight ourselves for what we are daily robbing and plundering from those who have as good a right to freedom as we have. Man, that is an honorable position, especially at the time in 1774.
This is from Deutsche Welle News. French President Emmanuel Macron said he does not want to rule out sending ground troops to Ukraine, as defeating Russia was essential to Europe's security. You can leave that up. I'm going to read you pretty much exactly what he said. He said, there's no consensus today to officially, openly, and with the endorsement, send troops on the ground. But in terms of dynamics, nothing should be ruled out. He's adding that allies will do everything necessary to ensure that Russia cannot win this war. So there's a lot of talk about what he said. The idea might be, as floated by Macron, kind of on a bilateral basis, NATO members sending troops into Russia. Well, it didn't go over as well as he had hoped. And in fact, that next picture will show the example of Macron. I love this picture because here's Macron, the tough guy. Francis Macron will not rule out boots on the ground in Ukraine. Look how tough he is. He's talking tough. Here's that same Macron a couple of days ago in France, when he was at an agricultural exposition and the French farmers showed up. Here's what he did when that happened. Let's put that next picture on. He's running for the exit. Definitely photo of the day, Macron running away from his own farmers. So here you have the essence of Macron, I think, in many ways. He loves to talk tough, but when the going gets rough, he starts running. You can find some interesting videos on Twitter of him dancing in the 80s. I'm not going to show any. I don't want to ridicule people. A lot of us looked goofy back then. But nevertheless, The suggestion that NATO as such would send troops into Ukraine obviously would invite a Russian retaliation, the fear of World War III being started if you start seeing French troops as such. Now, we know there are mercenaries there. We talked the other day about how many CIA paramilitaries and bases and things that have been set up over the past 10 years. We know that France lost a huge group of mercenaries a few weeks ago when Russia hit a hotel they were decamping to in advance of entering into battle, which infuriated France as well. So we know that there is already sort of sub rosa military activity from, people who are not on the official books of NATO soldiers. Nevertheless, as such, sending in the military of NATO countries definitely changes the dynamics of the situation there. And the other aspect that's somewhat humorous, maybe slightly less humorous than Macron running away from his own farmers and then talking tough talk about Russia, is the fact that what are they going to invade with? What are they going to use to invade? I think we talked a couple of weeks ago about how this new batch of British destroyers had gymnasiums put in where the missiles were supposed to be stored because they didn't have money to buy the missiles. We've talked on this show about how an assessment last year by the German Ministry of Defense that they would be able to survive for 2 days in a ground war. And we even have France. If you put on this next picture, this is from a piece that came out. France talking tough about invading Russia. Nevertheless, Europe looks abroad to get Ukraine weapons with Russia advancing. So they don't have enough weapons even to send Ukraine. They're looking to buy them outside of Europe. So they don't have any weapons. They don't have any troops. They have gymnasiums instead of missiles. Yet Macron is talking about invading Ukraine and head-to-head war against Russia. I would just like to add the next point. This is Andrew Korybko, who is an American analyst. I think he's based in Russia, but he's an insightful person and he's worth reading. I think he captures everything with this headline. NATO's debate over whether to conventionally intervene in Ukraine shows its desperation. Now think about that for a second. Is Macron projecting strength when he says, you know what, guys, we actually are going to need to go in there? What he's saying, what he's conveying with this point is that Ukraine is losing on the battlefield, and we've talked about the loss of Avdiivka. Since that happened a few days ago, there have been other Russian advances. It's clear that the rhetoric for the past 2 years of Ukraine winning, or Ukraine going to win, or just on the verge of winning with a little bit more money, those have all been lies, because the reality is there is desperation. They're desperate because they know that this venture is doomed to failure. They know that their proxy war with Russia via Ukraine is only resulting in hundreds of thousands of dead Ukrainians. If they were confident that Ukraine was winning, as they've been saying for 2 years, would they be talking about sending in NATO troops? Do you do that when you're about to win? I don't think so. I don't think you'd send American soldiers or French soldiers or German soldiers into Russia to fight and be killed, or to Ukraine to fight and be killed by Russians if you are confident, if you are winning, if you know it's inevitable with a couple more dollars that they will win. So it's a sign of desperation. Voters support the U.S. calling for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, including the release of hostages. Do you support or oppose U.S. calling for a permanent ceasefire and de-escalation? In this one, you have all likely voters. A total of 74% support the U.S., i.e. Joe Biden, calling for a permanent ceasefire and de-escalation, including the release of Israeli hostages from Gaza. That is a massive majority of Americans who feel that way. And the response from Joe Biden, well, it wasn't too encouraging. We have a little video of Biden when he was asked about whether or not, hey, are you going to call for a ceasefire? We're going to get a ceasefire. Well, let's have a look and see what Biden was up to when they were asking him this. Oh, he was eating ice cream. Let's listen in.
Can you give us a sense of when you think that ceasefire will start, sir?
Well, I hope by the beginning of the weekend. The end of the weekend. At least my national security advisor tells me that we're close. We're close. It's not done yet. And my hope is by next Monday we'll have a ceasefire.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, I guess in all fairness, that was an improvement on the part of our mainstream media. They didn't just ask him what flavor he was eating, which is what they usually do. But asked about this, he said, I hope it happens this weekend. I don't know. Don't ask me. I'm eating ice cream. Well, after he said this, it might happen by the weekend. The Israelis said, no, it's not going to happen this weekend. So he seems completely powerless. The only thing that he's been able to do is continue shoveling money and continue shoveling weapons to Israel, as not only do they slaughter the Gazans, the Palestinians in Gaza, but as they open a new front of war in the north, as they continue to bomb Syria. He seems to be completely powerless. And even as it is destroying his numbers in the polls, his reaction is, well, let's grab an ice cream cone. I hope my advisors tell me it's going okay. So things are not going okay for Biden. There was a primary in Michigan. He doesn't have essentially an opponent. He doesn't have an opponent as a Democrat. There are a couple of very minor candidates. He still only managed to get 80% of the vote in Michigan. And those numbers, well, it looks overwhelming. In fact, it's a danger sign, it's a warning sign, because there's an increasing anybody but Biden move in the Democratic Party. Doesn't look good for him.
Now, the best summary of Aristotle's achievements, of his good points and of his errors, is given by Aristotle himself at the end of what is now the final section of his works on logic. He is referring in this passage to his work in logic, but his remarks are applicable much more widely to his entire philosophy in all branches. Now, this passage that I have in mind is a fairly extended one, but I think it only fitting to conclude by reading it to you, giving the last word to Aristotle himself to assess his own achievements. Quote, "That our program then has been adequately completed is clear. But we must not omit to notice what has happened in regard to this inquiry. For in the case of all discoveries, the results of previous labors that have been handed down from others have been advanced bit by those who have taken them on, whereas the original discoveries generally make an advance that is small at first, though much more useful than the development which later springs out of them. For it may be that in everything, as the saying goes, the first start is the main part. And for this reason also it is the most difficult. For in proportion as it is most potent in its influence, so it is smallest in its compass, and therefore most difficult to see. Whereas when once the foundation is discovered, it is easier to add and develop the remainder in connection with it. This is in fact what has happened in regard to rhetorical speeches and to practically all the other arts. For those who discovered the beginnings of them advanced them in all only a little way, whereas the celebrities of today are the heirs, so to speak, of a long succession of men who have advanced them bit by bit and so have developed into their present form. Of this inquiry, in other words, logic, on the other hand, it was not the case that part of the work had been thoroughly done before while part had not. Nothing existed at all. For the training given by the paid professors of contentious arguments, that's the sophists, was like the treatment of the matter by Gorgias, for they used to hand out speeches to be learned by heart. And that was their idea, you see, of teaching logic. And therefore the teaching they gave their pupils was ready but rough, for they used to suppose that they trained people by imparting to them not the art, but its products, as though anyone professing that he would impart a form of knowledge to obviate pain in the feet were then not to teach a man the art of shoemaking, or the sources whence he can acquire anything of the kind, but were to present him with several kinds of shoes. For he would have helped him to meet his need, but he has not imparted an art to him. On the subject of reasoning, we had nothing else of an earlier date to speak of at all, but were kept at work for a long time in experimental researches. If then it seems to you after inspection that such being the situation as it existed at the start, our investigation is in a satisfactory condition, compared with the other inquiries that have been developed by tradition, there must remain for all of you, or for our students, the task of extending us your pardon for the shortcomings of the inquiry, and for the discoveries thereof, your warm thanks." Unquote. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
So in the wake of French President Emmanuel Macron's comments about Western countries not ruling out sending troops to Ukraine, a European official speaking to Financial Times pointed out that Western Special Operations Forces are already in the country. So this official, who is described as a senior European defense official, said, quote, "Everybody knows there are Western Special Forces in Ukraine. They've just not acknowledged it officially," end quote. And we do know that there are special forces in Ukraine because of the Discord leaks, which revealed last year that as of March 2023, there were 97 NATO special operations soldiers in Ukraine, including 14 Americans and 50 British soldiers. So the British had the biggest presence there. And this leak confirmed earlier reporting from The Intercept that said U.S. special operations forces were on the ground along with CIA operatives. And there was also early reporting that said British soldiers were on the ground in Ukraine. So we don't know, again, the Discord leaks, that was as of March 2023, which was a year ago at this point. So we don't know if that number has gone up, gone down, stayed the same. But this is confirmation from this European official that they are still there in some capacity. And Macron's comments also drew attention to the tens of thousands of foreign fighters who joined Ukraine's Foreign Legion. So the Washington Post had a report about that. And it said, I didn't realize this, that at least 50 American citizens have been killed fighting in Ukraine. 50 Americans. I wasn't aware that it was that high. French officials have insisted that Macron was not talking about sending a large number of troops to fight in Ukraine, suggesting that he was talking about training missions. Many NATO members distanced themselves from the remarks and said that they were not planning to send troops, but Macron received support from Lithuania, which said it was discussing sending troops for training. So Lithuania's defense minister said, quote, "We are talking about sending training missions, instructors. The decisions would be made on a multilateral basis," end quote. What they're playing with here is this risk of a Russia-NATO war, direct war, that could quickly turn nuclear. Representative Hakeem Jeffries, he's a Democrat from New York, and he's the top Democrat in the House. He has suggested that Democrats would protect House Speaker Mike Johnson from being ousted if he brought the $95 billion foreign military aid bill to the floor for a vote. So the situation, as things are right now, that $95 billion bill, which includes $60 billion for Ukraine, $14 billion to support Israel's slaughter of Palestinians. I know $4.8 billion for Taiwan and other related spending. And then there's also $3 billion for the AUKUS military pact between the U.S., Australia, and the UK. That's passed through the Senate. If it's brought to a vote in the House, it'll pass. You know, there's enough support there. But some Republicans have threatened to oust Johnson as Speaker if he holds a vote on the bill. And it would only take one Republican to file a motion to vacate the speakership, which would bring about a vote to oust him. So that's what happened to Kevin McCarthy. Matt Gaetz filed this motion to vacate, and he was ousted because every single Democrat voted against him and 8 Republicans voted against him. The rest of the Republicans voted for him to stay. So if the Democrats decided to protect McCarthy, he would still be in. So Jeffries is saying that some Democrats may be willing to promise to vote to keep Johnson as Speaker if he moves forward with this $95 billion monstrosity. So Jeffries said, quote, "It does seem to me, based on informal conversations, that were Speaker Johnson to do the right thing relative to meeting the significant national security needs of the American people by putting it on the floor for a vote, there will be a reasonable number of people in the House Democratic caucus who will take the position that he should not fall as a result," end quote. It's really amazing how he phrased that, what he's calling this foreign military aid bill, the national security needs of the American people, when it's, you know, going to go to Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and all these other places. So France has rejected a call from Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen to give $300 billion in frozen Russian central bank funds to Ukraine. And that's, you know, a step that would amount to outright theft. It would be a big escalation of the U.S. economic war against Russia. So Janet Yellen claimed, as I covered yesterday, that there was a legal case to support handing the funds to Ukraine to fund the proxy war and future reconstruction. But French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire said that there was no legal case to be made. He said, or maybe he didn't say there was no legal case to be made. He said it was not sufficient. He said, quote, "We don't think this legal basis is sufficient. This legal basis must be accepted not only by European countries, not only by the G7 countries, but by all the member states of the world community. And I mean by all the member states of the G20. We should not add any kind of division among the G20 countries," end quote. And that's going to be very hard because Russia is part of the G20. So the EU is moving forward with a plan to set up a fund for Ukraine using profits made by the frozen Russian money, which Le Maire pointed out. The U.S. has welcomed the plan, but they want the EU to go further. And they need Europe to be on board because European banks hold $200 billion of the Russian funds. The U.S. has about $67 billion. So, you know, the thinking here is definitely they're struggling to get this money, Congress to authorize this spending. So this is something that they're thinking, okay, we have all this Russian money. Let's just use that. Let's just send that to Ukraine. And Russia has warned that it has ways to respond if the U.S. and its allies go ahead and send the Russian funds to Ukraine.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
An article coming out tomorrow. It says, as the pre-trial hearings in the case of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and others who are charged with masterminding the 9/11 attacks proceed at the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base in Cuba, the government continues to stumble with its own witnesses. In hearings last week, government lawyers tried to demonstrate that statements the defendants made to CIA and FBI agents were voluntary. When the government's principal torturer, a retired psychologist, had difficulty recalling that during a torture session, he threatened one of his victims by offering to slit the throat of the victim's young son, and that he had recounted that threat under oath in previous testimony, it became apparent to all in the courtroom and those of us who monitor these awful proceedings that the government was encountering a strange and unexpected difficulty in defending the behavior of its torturers.
You know, when George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and Lindsey Graham, yes, same Lindsey Graham, concocted the Devil's Island and kangaroo court system on Guantanamo Bay. The Supreme Court invalidated the kangaroo court system and ordered that all trials be legitimate, real trials. They engaged in torture for a while in foreign countries, and then eventually at Guantanamo Bay itself. It wasn't until the FBI arrived that the FBI said, if you don't stop the torture, you're going to leave in handcuffs, because we're not allowed to participate in this, and we're required to arrest people that do it. To the credit of the FBI, of which you and I have been harshly critical, when they exceed their authority, they did the right thing on the torture. Nevertheless, they did interrogate these people who had been tortured. The government wants to use what these people said in Thailand during the torture sessions and afterwards in Guantanamo Bay after the torture had stopped. The government wants to use both sets of statements against them. It is the obligation of the government then to prove that both sets of statements, what was said under torture and what was said afterwards a year later in Guantanamo Bay, in some cases several years later, was so infected by torture or was voluntary and therefore can be used. In its efforts to demonstrate this, it puts the torturer in chief on. I'm sorry to say I've met this creep, because he was lauded by my then colleagues and friends at Fox News as a great American for having concocted these medieval tortures, the means of which I outlined briefly without getting too graphic in the article. It's a horrible, despicable human being who's been sued many, many times and keeps managing to evade liability for what he did. But nevertheless, they put him, the government put him on the witness stand as a government witness to testify what happened 20 years ago when, bingo, he doesn't remember. He doesn't remember. And then they showed him, wait a minute, you testified to this 4 years ago. You told us that you threatened to slit the son's throat. I don't remember. Here's your testimony from 4 years ago. Oh, yeah, I guess I did say it. Then they put a female FBI agent who was on there for the whole time, 5 years of all this interrogation. In one afternoon cross-examination, she said, mimicking Hillary Clinton in the famous pink dress interview, I don't recall, 199 times. Now the government's going, well, how can we possibly prove that the statements made under torture were voluntary if the torturer and the interrogator don't even remember what happened? Well, of course they remember. They don't want to be held liable for it by stating under oath that they recall what happened.
And how about you mentioned here that you talked about, you don't want to talk about what they've done to this guy, that Mohammed and others were violently tortured as various so-called CIA black sites outside the United States. They were raped, hanged by their wrists for weeks inside large refrigerators, beaten with fists and wooden boards, waterboarded, whereby water was forced into their nasal cavities so as to create the perception of suffocation and drowning. Then you go on to say that many of the records, all of this was destroyed by CIA officials, a crime for which no one has been prosecuted. Now, wasn't this woman who was a CIA person?
Oh, Bloody Gina. Yes.
Is that the person?
Yeah. Bloody Gina's records were not destroyed. Bloody Gina's records were actually exposed by reporters from the New York Times and the Washington Post, who got their hands on, I don't know how, on the summaries of the torture. You know, there have been so many different sets of torture. Bloody Gina was not involved in torturing Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, but she was involved in torturing others, and she wrote graphic reports back to her bosses in Langley. And lest you think this Bloody Gina thing was a joke, her nickname was given to her by her colleagues, and it's one of the reasons she was appointed director of the CIA by a president who loved when he heard that that was her nickname, Donald Trump.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
Next up, we've got Rand Paul talking about you know what? Let's watch it first.
So I travel to Washington every week from Bowling Green, Kentucky, where I live, and then I return at the end of the week. And I've been married 33 years as of last week. And I get home and I think, you know, when I knock on the door, my wife lets me in, I think, well, she'll have my slippers, maybe a hug and a kiss, maybe a martini. And you know what I usually get when I get home? I open the door and you know what she says to me? How come Anthony Fauci's not in jail yet?
How hot is Rand Paul's wife? Tell me that doesn't get you juiced up for your lady, where she's like, you can't come back into this house until you've completed your mission of getting Fauci into jail. And I think that Fauci going to jail would be cleansing for this nation, because as I argue with relatives at meals who have just gone on from the COVID thing, they still think the vaccines were a good idea. I'd like something more in their face, a better receipt to go, I was right, you were wrong. I would like that satisfaction. I would like to actually see, and that's the problem with these old people in office. That's why you only get power when you're really old, is so that you get so old that people are like, yeah, can't we just let this slide? The guy's an old person. That's why everyone in office should be capped at 85, so that we don't feel bad prosecuting them. Let's continue.
But it's not for lack of trying. I've referred him twice to the Department of Justice, but there is this guy over there, the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, who may be the most partisan Attorney General we've had. There used to be some sense of distance between the Attorney General and presidents in politics, but I think there is no longer. And we have the proof. We'd submitted the proof. Essentially, Anthony Fauci, in his own words, has admitted the truth. He lied in Congress, which is a felony, and we have the proof. It's in his own emails. It's in his own words. But if you look back in time and you want to know when the cover-up began, when the conspiracy began, it really began January 31st of 2020. The virus had only been out a couple weeks in China. The Chinese were still saying, oh, it's not transmitted between humans. This was months after the virus had really erupted. We know now that the virus started in the lab, that the first 3 people sick, we actually know their names, worked in a lab in Wuhan. They worked for Dr. Xi, the one they call the great bat scientist. The first patient 0 they actually think is Ben Hugh, a scientist who worked for. We know that because they declassified that in the Trump administration. They declassified that these 3 were sick. The X-ray findings were consistent with COVID. There wasn't a test for COVID. They had a test for the first SARS-1, the one that was the pandemic back in 2003 and 2004, but they didn't yet have a COVID test. But they had all the signs and symptoms of it. Will we ever prove they had it? Well, we could have early on in the disease if they'd come forward and admitted the truth and subjected serum for antibody analysis. We could have proved that they were the first patients. But all of the evidence points to that. We know the Chinese were dishonest in their death count. All likelihood, millions of people died in China, and yet there was no real accounting for that.
There we go. Rand Paul laying out the facts, telling us that he's still on the case. And hopefully, if Donald Trump gets into office, we'll have a new AG. They actually will prosecute Donald Trump, but will prosecute Fauci. But I think we all know that is not going to happen. Not that Trump won't win, but my guess is even if he does, he will just move on from it because he doesn't want to revisit his own failures of letting the guy remain in office. This one's wild. We've been talking about how at the beginning of the Ukraine war, we banished Russia from our payment systems. And what we've done is we let people know that they might not have access to our currency. And did we have a leading position where everyone's using our currency? We're able to rob them of our wealth. We're able to ship them our inflation. And are we weakening the United States by creating more incentives for people to, rely and utilize different currencies? Have we ruined the status of the U.S. dollar as the now oil contracts are being priced into other currencies? And so Janet Yellen's taking it even further, where the billions of dollars that have been seized of Russian assets that I guess were in American banks, she's saying we should hand this to the Ukraine. The Ukraine's in a war with Russia. Russia's done tremendous damage to the Ukraine in this illegal war. So maybe we should just give them those funds, which long term would probably be a pretty terrible escalation in terms of people not wanting to keep money with us. And then lastly, you've got presidents going down to visit the border. You've got Biden going down to where the wall actually exists to go, everything's fine here, man. I don't know what everyone's complaining about. It's pretty great out here. All right. And then we had one more topic I wanted to get into. Supreme Court weighs bump stock ban. I thought this one was pretty funny. So the guy who was arguing for why people need the bump stocks, once again, I think, you should be the guns are to keep the government in check. That we should be allowed to have all the guns and there shouldn't be any restrictions on them. Shouldn't have to go get a permit. Saying, hey, a permit because we need to make sure reasonable safety. Well, who gets to define reasonable? I don't know. If a government can't force everyone to even get an ID to vote because it's racist to get them IDs, well, then what's the process for reasonableness or swiftness that government's not impeding my constitutional right to bear a gun? I mean, I live in Connecticut. I have to get them. They got to take my teeth. I got to take a phone call with the person, I think the highest paid person in the state, and he's got to screen me, talk to me about my relationship with the neighborhood. I got to go take some classes. I should be able to just walk into a store, buy a gun, and be done with it. What right does government have to stop me from what the Constitution allowed me to do? But anyways, in this case, I thought this lawyer made a bad argument, and I thought the response was pretty funny, so I'll give it a read. Besides, he said bump stocks could have uses other than enabling machine gun-like fire. For instance, they can help people with disabilities, such as those who have arthritis in their fingers or otherwise might lack the ability to fire multiple rounds of ammunition. Why, asked Justice Sonia Sotomayor, would Congress think a person with arthritis needs to shoot 400 to 700 8-hour rounds of ammunition under any circumstance? She has a good point. I mean, the entire conversation is backwards because I shouldn't have to prove to you why I should be allowed to do something that the Constitution said I was allowed to do. But this guy did pick a pretty bad example of, well, if you limit the power of the Constitution, people with arthritis won't be able to shoot machine guns. And she's like, well, do people with arthritis need to shoot machine guns? I mean, the answer is, I guess, why should people with arthritis not be allowed to shoot machine guns? And can you defend your removing of their rights? But for me to put forward, hey, you need to change this law so that people with arthritis can shoot machine guns, not the most convincing of arguments.
The Peter Schiff Show.
I was watching on CNBC, and they're talking about this very topic, about how few stocks are going up and how almost all the gains are concentrated in this small group of stocks. And the commentator said, well, you don't really have to worry about it because it's happened before, right? It's not like this is unprecedented. We've seen this before. And they went over the 1960s with the Nifty 50 stocks, Xerox and Polaroid and stuff like that. And they said, well, it happened back then. And then they talked about the 1990 tech bubble, .com bubble, and said, well, it happened in the 1990s. And it happened in the 1960s, so we don't have to worry about it. It's happening again. Yeah, they conveniently overlooked what happened next. They forgot about the 1970s, where stocks got killed, right? The Nifty 50 blew up. Wasn't so nifty. The Dow was at 1,000 in 1966, and it was still at 1,000 in 1982. That's a long time to wait while inflation eviscerated the value of your money. Same thing with the tech bubble of the 1990s. That didn't end well. The market crashed. The NASDAQ was down 80% in the early 2000s. So the two periods of time that they said were similar to the one that we have right now ended in disaster for equities. At the same time, they're saying we don't have to worry about it because it happened before. We do have to worry about it because it did happen before, and look what followed. But the thing is, the economy is in so much worse shape now than it was in 1970 or 2000. We have a much bigger debt bubble. In fact, I looked at the national debt clock today. It's now above 34.4 trillion, so headed for 35 trillion. We're now adding about 200 billion a month because it's been 2 months and we've increased the national debt by 400 billion. So it's a little bit slower pace than we were at. We were at a faster pace. We were clocking in at like 4 trillion a year. So that's slowed down. If you annualize the last 2 months, that's 2.6 trillion in debt for the year, which is still a lot bigger than the official deficit estimates, which are a little under 2 trillion. But the real number is not what they estimate, but what's actually happening. Again, you just have to look at the national debt. However much it goes up, that's the budget deficit, no matter what they claim. So if they claim we have a $2 trillion budget deficit, but the national debt goes up by $3 trillion, they borrowed $3 trillion. That's the actual deficit, not what they're pretending it is. But they, for political reasons, they don't count a lot of stuff. It's like sometimes corporations report their earnings, and there's this extraordinary items, and we exclude this, we exclude that, and so these are our earnings that we're reporting, but they're not the actual earnings. Well, the government does the same thing with the budget. They have a bunch of items that they say, well, these are extraordinary. They're just, we're not going to count this. We're not going to count that. And so we're just going to count the things that we want to count. And we're going to ignore all the things that we don't want to count. Well, you can't ignore it. If you spent it, you spent it. The national debt goes up. It doesn't care if you meant to spend that money or not, or whether or not it was an out of the ordinary event. We still have to pay the money back. But the other disingenuous part of the process is every year we have the same events that they say are extraordinary and they're not recurring, except they happen every year. Right? So if we're spending money on the same stuff year after year after year, you can't keep saying to ignore it because it's an extraordinary expense. It's not if it's recurring. Right? Now maybe it's not the identical expense like natural disasters. Every time they have relief for a natural disaster, they don't count that. So if there's a hurricane, if there's wildfires, if there's an earthquake, whatever, a flood, and they spend the money, they say, well, that's off budget because it was for a flood. Yeah, except every year there's a different flood or there's a different fire. So you can't just ignore the fact that every single year the government is spending all this money on disaster relief and claim it's not part of the budget. It is. I mean, you got to admit it. This stuff's going to happen every year. But so the government does this, so the whole thing is a lie. But I think that we're going to start to pick up the pace of these deficits because a lot more debt is coming due this year. And as that low-yielding debt matures, we're talking where the government borrowed at 10 basis points, 25 basis points, 1%. All that stuff, all those 1 year, 3 year, 5 year notes that are coming due this year and now have to be rolled over at 400 basis points, 425 basis points, 500 basis points, right? That's going to add considerably to the national debt. So these numbers are going to rise faster. The economy is going to weaken. Unemployment, I think, has turned. We're starting to see that in the numbers. So we're going to get more people collecting unemployment. We're going to have fewer people paying taxes. More minimum wage hikes are going into effect this year. I was reading more about California. They've got a $20 minimum wage now for fast food workers. So a lot of fast food workers in California are going to lose their jobs. A lot of fast food restaurants are going to go out of business. I read that they actually made an exemption in the law that said if you're a fast food restaurant but you bake your own bread, that you're exempt. Now, why did they do that? Well, apparently Panera Bread, the company, was a major contributor, big donor to the governor of California, who a lot of people think is going to be the presidential nominee, right? A lot of money was given to Gavin Newsom's campaign from Panera Bread, and so he's stuck in an exemption that says everybody has to pay the minimum wage, $20 minimum wage, unless you happen to bake bread, which is like, oh, Panera Bread bakes the bread. Now, the first thing I thought of when I saw this is, all right, well, why doesn't McDonald's just start baking their buns? I mean, it's got to be cheaper than paying everybody $20 an hour. And I tweeted that out, and somebody replied to my tweet and said, but in the law, it says it only applies to companies that were baking bread in 2023. So you can't just start baking bread. You had to have already been baking your bread. So clearly that means it's not about bakeries. It's about Panera Bread. It's about rewarding somebody who made a big contribution to your campaign.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Unfortunately, and, to some extent, understandably, they're going to completely misdiagnose the problem. They'll think it's, quote, the system, which in effect, it is the system. It's just they're going to identify the wrong system as being the culprit. And this has been an issue. This has been a problem with the Fed since it was created, that the Fed creates all kinds of instability, creates bubbles, it creates prices that are out of whack. It artificially, for example, the whole war sector of the economy is made possible by the Fed. So it blows up parts of the economy that wouldn't exist at that size. And people think that's capitalism. And yet no one says, but the Fed is doing this. What are the consequences of what the Fed is doing? That's just so off the table. So the Fed causes all this mischief and the market economy gets the blame.
Well, and let's also lay some of the blame at the feet of economists themselves, professional economists, academic economists, because their entire job as social scientists is in part to help us understand the unseen, the seen and the unseen. We're all familiar with that concept. Of course, Per Byland wrote a book with that title, The Seen and the Unseen, because it's very easy for a young person to become disillusioned with, let's say, their job prospects, their student loan debt, their housing availability, all these kind of things, and to look at the landscape and say, well, I'm going to vote for Bernie Sanders or something like that. I want student loan forgiveness. I want rent control. I want free. I want food stamps. I want free health care. I want to go to grad school for free. You can understand why people would gravitate towards this mindset, because that's the scene. It's very easy for government to take money or borrow money or print money and create some of these scene effects and say, okay, we're going to build a housing subdivision for poor people. That's going to be brick and mortar. You can see that. So a brick and mortar housing development, let's say, built by a city government in a place like Chicago, that's visible to people. They can see that. They can understand that someone can actually live in it. What they can't see and understand so easily is the opportunity costs of that money or those taxes or that debt to the city and what else could have been done in the marketplace. So it's a real problem for those of us who are more in the Austrian or libertarian side of things to explain to people the second and third order effects of what the Fed does. And what we really have to understand, and I think this goes so unbelievably unremarked, is how unusual the last 4 decades have been in human history. If you look at the period from roughly 1982 to 2022, across not only the United States, but really across the West, central banks pushed interest rates down and down and down, not in a linear fashion, but generally speaking, over 40 years. So what does that do? What happens when you spend 4 decades making credit cheaper than it otherwise would be, at least in our opinion, in the view of a lot of critics of the Fed? What happens when the most important price in the economy, the price of borrowing money or the price of saving, is, I'm not going to say set by a central bank, I'm going to say it's targeted and influenced by a central bank. What happens? That's the question that David Stockman asks in The Great Deformation. And I would argue that what happens is actually very profound, that saving becomes less and less attractive to people, borrowing becomes more and more attractive to people, and that filters out, that flows through the economy in ways which are just absolutely remarkable, in ways we don't think about too much. Maybe people buy that BMW instead of that Ford Taurus because interest rates are low and they can get a 0 or 1% car loan. You can't get that today, but you could a while back. Maybe they live in a fancier, larger house than they otherwise would. Maybe they take vacations in Europe instead of driving to the Grand Canyon. Maybe they send their kids to a more expensive college than they otherwise would, because anybody can get a student loan. It's really remarkable if we start to think about the cultural and social ramifications of monetary and fiscal policy beyond just the economics of it. And, there have been some attempts to touch on this. Obviously, Guido Hulsmann wrote a book the ethics of money production, which is really fascinating.
Yeah.
I'd love to see that updated to account for, the moral hazards surrounding the 2008 bailouts and for the unbelievable, extraordinary monetary and fiscal policy that accompanied COVID in 2020. I mean, the rent moratoriums, not from the Housing Authority, but from the CDC. I mean, what does that mean when you tell people that they don't have to pay their rent for an extended period, that they don't have to pay interest on their student loans or mortgages for an extended period? How does that moral hazard flow through the economy? What does it mean to landlords? What does it mean to the so-called rule of law? When you purchase, let's say, a townhouse or a condominium as a rental property for extra income, thinking that, well, if I don't get paid rent in my town, I can go to the local court system, use the eviction process, and have the people out, let's say, within a month at not too much legal expense to myself, and I can fix it up and rent it again. I mean, that's a presumption. We all think of contracts in America as something that are enforced. But what happens when a rent moratorium comes along because of a virus, because of flu virus? I mean, the ramifications of that are going to be huge. We're already seeing that. We're already seeing a lot of individuals getting out of the owning housing, especially the Airbnb and VRBO market. And we're seeing larger corporate players, the boogeymen like BlackRock, coming in and purchasing up more of that housing stock. So we have to, I think, view this stuff through a cultural and social lens, not just a lens of economics or finance. I also think we'll benefit from that because I think the left does a very good job of coming at things from an emotive angle, from tugging on the heartstrings, from making populist arguments. And I think the libertarian right has shied away from that. And really what's going on both the fiscal and monetary side, it isn't just harmful to the economy, it's evil. It's contrary to human nature, to the whole thrust of human civilization, which is capital accumulation and cultural accumulation over decades. And when we start to mess with that, when we start to encourage people through policy to basically consume material and cultural capital rather than build it and save it, we're in trouble. And we're not just in trouble economically, we're in trouble, I would argue, morally.
Anyway, I want to go through a couple of quick things. This week, looks like they're going to be voting on the supplemental budget. If you remember, around the first of the year, they said, okay, we'll put in a stopgap. It'll last us a few weeks. Let's get these appropriations bills out. Let's do our actual job in Congress, and then we'll move on. Well, guess what? They didn't do that. They had to kick Santos out. They had to pass about 1,000 resolutions saying how wonderful Israel is. They had to do all sorts of things, but accept their job. And so now they're back in the bind again. They're saying, we got to do a stopgap. We've got to keep things going. We don't want to shut down. No one wants a government shutdown. Well, a lot of us do, actually. So here's Thomas Massie, our great friend of liberty. He is on the board of the Ron Paul Institute. He put out a tweet yesterday, and it says, the first installment of the omnibus is allegedly coming up for a vote next week. They've been writing this behemoth behind closed doors for weeks. If just 1/3 of U.S. representatives will oppose it, we can stop this monstrosity. So it's ready. It's coming. They've been writing it in secret. This is something that they're doing more and more of. They present, and Senator Mike Lee says this a lot. And I had a tweet. I should have clipped it, but he's complaining. He's saying the next GOP leader in the Senate should stop doing this stuff in secret. And that's, I think, a very, very good argument. So now here's an article from, I think it is Politico. I could be wrong. I didn't clip it. But so this is what's going to happen. Both chambers, yeah, it is Politico. Both chambers only have a couple of days to pass this stopgap before a partial government shutdown kicks in on Saturday. I think they may be actually voting on it today. And there's still a few hiccups on that point. Now, Speaker Johnson will almost certainly need help from Democrats to pass the measure in the House. Now, we will remember that Speaker McCarthy was defenestrated for his threat to use Democrats to help pass more aid bills. It looks like Johnson's going to have to do that which McCarthy was so robustly denounced for doing. So if you go to the next one, here's why he's going to have to need help. And here's Massey giving us some hope. He says, if 145 out of the 220 Republicans vote against it, we can stop it. They plan to suspend the rules to pass this, which means they need a 2/3 majority. Now, this you're seeing increasingly happening in the House. And Johnson did it a couple of weeks ago. If you remember, on aid to Israel, he suspended the rules, which means you go around the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee is very powerful, and Thomas Massie happens to be on that Rules Committee. That's one of the deals he made when he decided to support Speaker McCarthy. A very smart deal on the part of Massie, and there are a few others. So they go around the Rules Committee, they bring it directly to the floor. This technique was originally, or it is intended for quote-unquote non-controversial bills. So by going around the Rules Committee, sneaking around the back, okay, but you have to have a 2/3 majority to pass that, and that's going to be tricky. So Massey's saying, we got to get 145 Republicans. So even if all the Democrats jump on board with this stopgap, they need to get 145 Republicans, so that will deprive them of the 2/3 majority. So keep an eye out for that. coming up maybe today. I didn't look this morning. Maybe today that vote will be coming up and is very important. I want to do a final update on the war front. Yesterday we talked a little bit about Francis Macron saying, hey, let's go in to Ukraine. Let's send troops. Well, it didn't go over very well. And this is an interesting, I would say, shot across the bow, an interesting rebuttal from the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. He revealed something that people are not that happy about. Probably the worst kept secret, but nevertheless, a head of state saying it. Put on that next one. British soldiers helping fire Ukrainian missiles, Olaf Scholz reveals. The German Chancellor is criticized for flagrant abuse of intelligence that could endanger UK personnel on the ground and help the Russians. So that's how they frame it. Endanger UK personnel on the ground. Well, of course, if they are acting in their military capacity in Ukraine, well, of course they're targets. And it's obvious. This shouldn't be a surprise. Here's another article about, I think this is from the Daily Mail. Germany is accused of being completely irresponsible after claiming British troops are helping Ukraine fire missiles at Putin's forces. So stop and sort of breathe that in for a second. British military personnel, whether they're active duty or quote unquote retired and retained, are in Ukraine firing missiles at Russia. And the only concern among the mainstream media is, how dare he reveal this? Rather than how dare they send troops? Are they insane? Do they want World War III? No, well, there's the media for you. So the final thing I wanted to do, as you know, the U.S. has been involved in keeping the Red Sea safe and open for international shipping. We know, we've talked about on the show, that has not gone as well as planned. It's not Deus Vult. You can't just will it. This goes back to the neocons. You can't just will something to happen and have it happen. Every now and again in life, you come across a Houthi situation, right? Where the underdog actually hits you with something asymmetric that you didn't plan for. So let's take a look. The Germans, they joined in, and they joined in with us helping clear the Red Sea. Let's take a look. How's that operation going? Just in, the German frigate Hessen mistakenly fired at a U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone over the Red Sea on Monday. Both missiles malfunctioned and fell into the seas. So you have Germany. They're out there making the Red Sea safe for democracy and freedom. They see a U.S. drone. They fire 2 missiles on it. Thankfully, both missiles were no good, and they fell into the sea. And here's an update. New problems, according to media reports. There are no more missiles in German depots for 2 of the 3 types this frigate can fire. So he fired both of his missiles, and there aren't any more in Germany for them to have. So that is the extent of the German operation in the Red Sea. I don't know what they're going to do. They don't have missiles. Maybe they'll just wave their hands very aggressively and scare the Houthis off. Who knows? But anyway, here's the lesson for today. The experts, at least in the foreign policy area, are dumb, but they keep advancing by being dumb, and trying to maintain a global military empire is also dumb and dangerous. So with that said, I want to thank everyone for tuning in.
Philosophy has no hope of becoming popular if it has a weak ethics. Why then has Kant's philosophy, as opposed to Aristotle's, had the most influence on subsequent movements? Isn't Aristotle's ethics more practicable and more appealing to the man on the street? A perfectly good question, but you don't fully interpret me correctly. I can think offhand of 4 points to make. To begin with, Kant's ethics has certain attributes that Aristotle's doesn't. It is ruthlessly consistent. And it has, therefore, the force of absolute consistency of a kind that nobody else's has, and certainly that Aristotle's, with its mixture of Platonist elements and Aristotelian elements. And that's a big advantage to an ethics. Nothing is more crucial in morality than the passion that comes from absolute ruthless consistency. Kant makes no bones about it. Now, Aristotle is not on the defensive philosophically, but he's not very enthusiastic about ethics. That is not his forte. He is not preeminently a moralist, and therefore his ethics lacks a kind of fire or passion, which comes across only occasionally, as in his description of the magnanimous man. Second, Kant's ethics, however vicious it is universally practicable. That is to say, no one can practice it, but in another sense, it's not designed for any special class of men. Everyone can wreck his life on it equally if he wants to try it. Aristotle's is definitely aristocratic, if you take it as a whole, because of the stress on contemplation as an end in itself and presupposing wealth of high intelligence, etc. And so necessarily it would seem irrelevant to the great mass of people. Thirdly, very crucially, this is perhaps the most important, throwing the preceding 2 points into insignificance in a way, Kant cashed in on millennia of Christianity, or 1800 years of a powerfully established Christian context which was absolutely taken for granted, and he simply drove people to the wall given that context. Aristotle took the first steps in a brand new direction without any ancestors or context at all. He had before him only Plato or the Sophists. Now you have to understand this point. It is much, much easier for you today to be receptive to a philosophy that preaches reason than it would be if the same people with the same honesty and the same intelligence existed in the 4th century BC. Because, I'm not speaking of any one of you in person or being insulting, but I include myself and I mean it as applied to mankind in general. At that period of human knowledge, to go by reason was a complete unknown. There were no theories to say what it would consist of or what it would mean in practice. To live avowedly and self-consciously by a philosophy of reason and to know what that would mean, you would have to be a first-rate independent philosopher. It would simply not be possible for the decent man on the street to do it. He would have no way to figure out what are all the implications and applications and how do you do it and how do you solve all these endless problems, etc. It's only after centuries and centuries where we acquired the rudiments of, and of course even there mankind is still today in a moral wilderness. But now we have, of course, after Aristotle and the Industrial Revolution and modern science and the birth of the United States of America and the development of language, etc., we have some guidelines. And even those proved insufficient, as you know, and we're in process of losing them. And that's, of course, is the crucial need of objectivism, the objectivist ethics. But you cannot ask why did the people of Aristotle's time not endorse him, because after all he was better than the rest. It simply is anachronistic historically. It couldn't have happened. I don't think it could have happened even if Aristotle had had a completely consistent philosophy. It would have taken centuries and centuries to absorb such a revolution. But as it was, he had an inconsistent one, and that simply made it worse. Now, I will conclude this question, though, by giving one point to Aristotle, and that is, there is a sense in which Aristotle always has won out in human history. Insofar as people act or function at all, they do function on an Aristotelian base. Insofar as they accomplish anything of value, that they cannot escape. And in that crucial sense, the common man does go for Aristotle, only he doesn't know about Aristotle, and he doesn't know that you can't combine the Nicomachean Ethics and the Sermon on the Mount. And in that same sense, nobody can live by Kant. All they can do is destroy themselves and society in the process. That's about as much as I want to say on that question.
So CNN reported on Thursday that U.S. officials believe that Israel is planning to launch a ground invasion into Lebanon in late spring or early summer if a diplomatic solution is not reached. So a senior Biden administration official said, quote, "We are operating in the assumption that an Israeli military operation is in the coming months, not necessarily imminently in the next few weeks, but perhaps later this spring. An Israeli military operation is a distinct possibility," end quote. So notice he's saying that the U.S. is operating under the assumption that Israel is going to launch a ground incursion into Lebanon. Israel and Hezbollah have been trading heavy fire across the border since October 7th, and Israeli officials have been hinting about invading southern Lebanon if Hezbollah does not move back from the border. That's what they're saying they want. But this administration official said that an agreement that only pushes Hezbollah back would not be enough for Israel. The U.S. official said that Israel wants to go into Lebanon to mow the grass, to destroy some of Hezbollah's infrastructure. And that's a term Israel has always used for their bombing campaigns in Gaza before the current one, that they just got to go in there, kill a few hundred people, and mow the grass every once in a while. So if an invasion does not happen, this official is saying that Israel wants some sort of buffer zone where either troops from Lebanon's regular army or UN peacekeepers are deployed. A second administration official said that while there is talk about a diplomatic solution, there is a growing group within the Israeli government that says, this is the way the official put it, he says they're saying, hey, let's just take a shot, let's just do it. Let's just take a crack at a war in Lebanon. The official said that an Israeli ground incursion could lead to, quote, a major escalation that we don't even know the proportions of, end quote. So U.S. intelligence has determined that if Israel escalates the situation into a full-blown war, it likely would not be able to handle fighting Hezbollah and maintaining military operations in Gaza. And I believe Israeli intelligence has said this as well. And that means Israel is probably looking for the U.S. to directly intervene if this full-blown war in Lebanon happens. Sources close to Hezbollah have said that the group would halt attacks on northern Israel if a ceasefire was reached in Gaza, but Israel is sending the other message saying that ceasefire in Gaza means escalation in Lebanon. And the U.S. officials have acknowledged that a war in Lebanon would benefit Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is expected to face a political reckoning for allowing the October 7th attacks to happen. once the Israeli operations in Gaza are over. So there was an interesting quote here from one of these administration officials. The official said, quote, once the war is over, his expiration date arrives. So he needs to maintain the impression, maintain the narrative that Israel is still in the middle of a campaign to try to stave off efforts to remove him, end quote. Despite Netanyahu's motive for a major regional war and the massive civilian casualty rate in Gaza, the U.S. continues to provide Israel with this unconditional military support. And I covered this, I think, a few months ago at this point, but U.S. officials told HuffPost that they believe President Biden's policy of unconditional military aid to Israel could embolden Israel to expand in Lebanon and lead the U.S. into a major Middle East war. So President Biden on Thursday walked back a prediction he made earlier this week that a ceasefire in Gaza could be reached by Monday, as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called Hamas's demands delusional, signaling that a hostage deal is not close. So Biden was asked, do you still think a ceasefire is possible by Monday? That's something he predicted earlier this week. And Biden said, quote, hope springs eternal. I was on the telephone with the people in the region. I'm still probably not by Monday, but I'm hopeful, end quote. So when Biden first predicted a ceasefire by Monday, both Hamas and Israeli officials said that he spoke too soon. Hamas officials have said the main gap right now is still the fact that they want a permanent ceasefire. They want the Israeli troops to withdraw, and Israel clearly does not want that. And the U.S., they just want to pause the slaughter of Palestinians. So in Tel Aviv on Thursday, Netanyahu placed all the blame for the lack of a deal on Hamas. He said, quote, we face a brick wall of delusional, unrealistic Hamas demands, end quote. And he added that Hamas, quote, knows its demands are delusional and is not even trying to move close to an area of agreement. That's the situation, end quote. You remember Netanyahu rejected Hamas's last offer, which was a 135-day ceasefire and the release of all the Israeli hostages, the release of about 1,500 Palestinian prisoners. And the goal was to reach a lasting deal at the end of that. So Russian President Vladimir Putin said in a speech on Thursday that Russia's nuclear arsenal is in full combat alert, a warning that comes after French President Emmanuel Macron said the idea of NATO deploying troops to Ukraine was not ruled out. So Putin said this in an address to the Federal Assembly, which is both chambers of the Russian parliament. He said, quote, the strategic nuclear forces are on full combat alert and the ability to use them is assured, end quote. And then later in the speech, he specifically addressed the talk of NATO sending troops to Ukraine. He said, quote, they are selecting targets to strike on our territory and contemplating the most efficient means of destruction, end quote. And there he's likely referring to U.S. and NATO intelligence support for Ukraine. He went on, quote, now they have started talking about the possibility of deploying NATO military contingents to Ukraine. But remember what happened to those who sent their contingents to the territory of our country once before. Today, any potential aggressors will face far graver consequences. And he says Russia has weapons capable of striking targets on their territory, end quote. And he also said that the West was spooking the world about the threat of nuclear conflict and asked if they really know what that means. So that's his response to what Macron said. And now let's see, after Macron made those comments, there was a big uproar, but he is doubling down on this idea of not ruling out sending troops to Ukraine. So Macron, the French president, on Thursday stood behind his comments about NATO not ruling out sending troops to Ukraine, despite the uproar that it caused and the warning that it drew from Russia. He told reporters, quote, these are sufficiently serious issues. Every one of the words that I say on this issue is weighed, thought through, and measured, end quote. So he said, he thought it all out when he made those comments, and here he is doubling down. And this is on the same day that you have Russia talking about nuclear weapons and issuing this warning to the West, but that does not faze the French president.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
Tech-heavy NASDAQ jumped nearly 1% to close at an all-time high. The S&P also closed at a record low. Yep, the Dow Jones Industrial ticked up. And all the reason, because data showed Federal Reserve's preferred measure of inflation didn't exceed Wall Street's forecasts. Meanwhile, the pending home sales dropped in January because the mortgage rates are so high, and they're down almost 5% for the month, and that's worse than what they projected at 2%. So yeah, the markets are going up. It's a one-man game. I mean, the bigs own everything, and they're in control. Magnificent Seven. Isn't that a nice name? Magnificent. They're so magnificent. So yeah, the equity markets are where they are. Oil prices, the Brent crude is still hanging around that $84 a barrel. And if the Israel war keeps heating up, you're going to go up more. And the Ukraine war is going to heat up again. They're not going to back down. The United States and Europe, they're going to do everything they can to ramp this up. So, and in crypto's, you saw it hit 63,000. Now it's around 62,000. And again, we call this point for point in your trends journal. We're very bullish on Bitcoin and gold. Gold today closed around 2042. And again, when they start lowering interest rates, the dollar's going to go down because the dollar's only strong because interest rates are so high. You got this U.S. debt load at over $34 trillion. It's a fucking joke. And the weaker the dollar gets, the stronger gold gets. So again, besides my guns, gold, and a getaway plan, because we're going into very dangerous times, and I've been doing this for 44 years, I've never seen anything as dangerous as we're facing right now, geopolitically, socioeconomic wise. And so those, again, we don't give financial advice. We give you our trend forecasts, our trends analysis, trend forecasts, and you do what you want to do. So, by the way, the Wall Street Journal, it really is the Wall Street Journal. There's not a story here worth front page. McConnell to resign as GOP Senate leader, big fucking deal. Supreme Court agrees to hear Trump's claim on immunity, big fucking deal. Contrarian at the Fed picks up his own followers, big fucking deal. New York accuses meatpacker of lying about climate. Again, and then they used to have on the second page, Supreme Court weighs bump stock ban. I buy this thing for data. They used to have some great analysis by their Wall Street Journal people. All gone. They've been firing people one after another. Cooling demand puts electric car startups in a bind, is one of the articles they have in the Wall Street Journal. Go to your top trends for 2024. And what do we have? EV, FU. We've been warning about this for years. It's an overhyped electric cars. They're fucking batteries that were invented in 1800. Again, instead of putting all the money into the military-industrial complex, if they put this money into research and development, we'd have clean everything. And again, Eisenhower, 5-star general, supreme commander of the Allied forces, 2-term president, warns the American people that the military-industrial complex is robbing the nation of the genius of the scientists. Sweat of the labors and the future of the children. And here we are. We're the future of the children. We're plantation workers of Slavelandia as the rich own everything. And the military-industrial complex, the scientists. If scientists would have been putting their money into things that help humanity. Fuck that, only war machine. And you know what they're going to do in the EU? Or is it the FU? They're putting a bill in to ban repairs on cars that are 15 years old. Yeah. Again, they're poisoning us in a million fucking ways, but climate change. And again, I have a 1994 Audi, so I guess I wouldn't be allowed to live in Europe. And then we have the warmonger that plays our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. Yeah, guy that loved to kill people in Iraq and Afghanistan. His former job was sitting on the board of directors of Raytheon, the second largest defense contractor in the United States. He said today that Israel killed over 25,000 Palestinian women and children. Actually, the number's well over 30,000, and it gets worse. And he goes on to say that Austin said that, again, this is the former Raytheon board member, said that the U.S. has provided Israel with 21,000 munitions since October 7th, which does not include the American-provided bombs Israel, of course, is armed with, as it receives almost $4 billion a year in military equipment. As the plantation workers of Slavelandia, you can't pay your rent. The railroads are a piece of shit. Subways are a night in Calcutta. The homeless are all over the fucking streets. Migrants pouring in. But hey, that's okay. Don't get excited, Salenti.
But let's go through a little bit more of this. And this is just some of what was done, okay? What's some of what the American presidents have done during all of this time period? Okay, George W. Bush also tore up multiple treaties that we were in with Russia. Every single one of the presidents that he just named oversaw NATO expansions moving east. George W. Bush also put dual-use rocket launchers into Poland when his justification was that they were there to make sure that Iran can't nuke Europe with the nukes that they don't have. But Vladimir Putin saw this as a direct security concern. He's mentioned it over and over and over, the latest of which was in the interview with Tucker Carlson, but he's talked about this in almost every speech he's given that I've read or listened to over the last 10 years. Okay, so there's George W. Bush, and I'm just rattling off some. We could go on this for a long time. Barack Obama, attempted to overthrow an allied government of his in Syria, and he successfully backed the overthrow of the government in Ukraine. These are kind of big deals. We didn't even mention arming the jihadists in Chechnya, but whatever. So Donald Trump tore up the INF treaty, or withdrew from the INF treaty. Donald Trump sent weapons into Ukraine while they were in the middle of a civil war that was a direct result from the coup in 2014 that Barack Obama and Joe Biden backed. You can go listen to the Victoria Nuland phone call, right? When she's talking about how she goes, we're in play. We got to glue this thing. Here's who's going to be in the new government. Here's who's not going to be in the new government. And who do they say is going to get on the phone to give him an attaboy? She says Joe Biden, the vice president at the time, who was very involved in the Ukrainian policy, part of the reason why his son got such a sweetheart deal from that Burisma Ukrainian gas company. So yes, I mean, Ben Shapiro, if you just want to have the most superficial way, like if your understanding of politics is like, I watch The View once a week, then yes, this would be what you know, that the president said nice things about Putin. If you actually like read books and know what actually happened, no, they were all taking more and more aggressive postures toward Vladimir Putin. And Putin, during this time, was over and over again asking them to stop. Even asking to join NATO at one point. Anyway, it's just there's much more to this than Ben Shapiro is explaining. And of course, he's doing this because, as all these war hawks do, they start from their conclusion and then they work backward. The conclusion is, we want to support this war. So now let's work back from there. Oh, look, all these presidents were nice to Putin, and look, it still ended up being this. But so then as Joe Biden comes back into office, you can't remove it from the context that Joe Biden was the guy, back in 2014, who was kind of the point man on this Ukrainian operation. So that's something that Vladimir Putin sees too. And meanwhile, all along this whole time, he had always maintained, as I've talked about ad nauseum, but there's the Niet means Niet memo that you can read yourself, which was a private cable that Julian Assange leaked. That's the only reason we know about it. This was not for the public. This was Burns, who was the Russian ambassador, sending a cable back to the then Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, in which he explains in no uncertain terms that Ukrainian entry to NATO is Putin's red line. And like it's the memo is in diplomatic language, but he's basically saying this is his red line and he's not bluffing. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis to Vladimir Putin, and he will go to war over this. And he says in the memo that he doesn't want to, because he doesn't want to go to war, but he will. He will feel like he has to if you put Ukraine in NATO. And a couple months after that, at the Bucharest summit, they announced that they were putting Georgia and Ukraine in NATO. Okay, and this was the very beginning of real trouble in that relationship. And essentially, I mean, we can get into more of this later, but this is what the fight's all been over. And people who pretend it's not are deluding themselves. Now, how's this? Let's hear from NATO's Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg. I might be mispronouncing that name, but I don't know if you remember this, Rob, but this was from late last year. He kind of, every now and then where they say the thing they're not supposed to say. So this is the head of NATO who's saying this. This is the Secretary General of NATO. Quote, President Putin declared in the autumn of 2021 and actually sent a draft treaty that they wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us and was a precondition for not invading Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that. He went to war to prevent NATO. Continuing, this is the head of NATO speaking. This is not the lefties or John Mearsheimer. He went to war to prevent more NATO, close to his borders. He has got the exact opposite. So you can see Stoltenberg here he's still trying to sell the thing, and he's saying, well, look, he wanted no more NATO, and look, now NATO's expanding even more because these countries are scared that he's going to invade them. So he was trying to make the point that, Vladimir Putin's so dumb and we're so smart because we're getting what we want and he's not getting what he wants. But he kind of gave away the game while he was doing it, didn't he? He totally admitted that Vladimir Putin offered, and look, I know, dude, people will say when you talk about this, are you defending Vladimir Putin? Why are you seem to be disagreeing with the guy who's criticizing Vladimir Putin and correcting the record on his behalf, but it's not a defense of Vladimir Putin because he's still wrong to invade the country. But this is what happened. The head of NATO is telling you, he just wanted us to promise that his biggest neighbor would not be in our military alliance. That's what the whole thing was over. Not territorial expansion, not something that happened in the year 1300. It was that simple. The request was, I can't have Ukraine in your military alliance. They can be neutral, but just promise me you won't put them in NATO. I need that in writing. And here is The head of NATO telling you, and we said, nope, suck on that. We're never putting that in writing. Too bad. And if you're promising to not invade, if we put this in writing, the answer is no. That's what happened here. Sorry. Might be a bitter pill to swallow if you've been eating up all this propaganda, but that's what led to this war. And the fucking head of NATO admits it himself.
Now, in Arizona, they actually did move forward with some of this as well. A bill that just passed yesterday in the state Senate has to go through the House. This is Senate Bill 1633, would establish a bullion depository in the state of Arizona. This, Mike writes, would serve as a safe storage for precious metals and would facilitate the use of gold and silver as legal tender with a specie-backed transactional currency. Of course, in places like Utah, they have the gold back, so you can do transactions with physical gold in person. But so much of our activities, especially economically, for many of us, you have to do it, well, on the internet. And so you need a way to be able to pull this off. And putting specie and gold and silver in a depository like the Texas Bullion Depository, which has been open for a number of years, or UPMA, which has been open for a number of years, the privately run one in Utah, you can facilitate the ability to make seamless transactions with like a debit card, and it does the conversions in the background. Well, this passed forward in the Arizona State Senate by a vote of 16-11 yesterday. And here from Meharry, he also points out that they set up in this legislation the ability to hold reserves. The state treasurer, he says, may deposit a portion of state monies in the depository in the form of bullion. And that bullion deposit is considered part of this state's financial reserve. So weathering a really nasty financial storm, one of the best ways is going to be to use actual money rather than FRNs, that dirty government fiat. Private individuals and businesses would also be able to deposit bullion in the depository. And of course, they want to enable day-to-day transactions. And here from the legislation, a person or this state that holds the transactional currency with 100% backing in gold and silver may use that transactional currency as legal tender to pay a debt, or may assign it to another person or to this state. Now, speaking of Indiana and a central bank digital currency, they were the first to take that small step of removing it from the definition of money under the UCC. Now they're doing a follow-up. The ground of liberty, Thomas Jefferson told us, is to be gained by inches, because it takes time to convince people what is even for their own good. You have to keep pushing forward. We have to eternally press forward for what is yet to get. So last year, they removed a central bank digital currency from the definition of money under the Uniform Commercial Code. Now, some people who know what they're doing could do an end run around that, but it's still a step forward. Now they're following up with Senate Bill 180, which already passed both houses. It's off to the governor for a signature or maybe a veto. And this would prohibit state agencies from accepting payments made with a CBDC for any service, tax, license, permit, fee, information, or other amount due to the government body. It would also bar government agencies from requiring payments to be made with a CBDC. So it passed the House by a vote of 83-11, easy peasy, and unanimous in the state Senate. So that is in Indiana. Another big piece of the police state is civil asset forfeiture. It's legalized government robbery, and we never report on things happening positive in New York, but, well, never say never, right? Because on Tuesday, Mike Meharry writes, a New York Senate committee passed a bill that would not just reform civil asset forfeiture and make it look pretty on the outside, but it completely eliminates the program, eliminates civil asset forfeiture, and replaces it with a criminal process. In other words, we can only say that you lose this property if you gained it through the commission of a crime and you've been convicted of that crime. Now, yes, most criminal laws probably shouldn't exist, but that's another step forward that needs to be dealt with later. So passage of this one would also opt the state out of a vast majority of the federal civil asset forfeiture program called equitable sharing, which helps states do an end run around any restrictions. So that is in New York, Senate Bill 2192. It passed out of committee by a vote of 9-4. It needs to go to the second committee before the full chamber can consider it, if they allow that to even happen. We'll see. And in Maryland, a House committee just this week held a hearing on a bill to strictly limit the ability to carry out no-knock warrants. I would say, I'm sure there's a little loophole in there, but on its face, it looks like they've basically ended the process if this were to pass. So the legislation would prohibit judges from issuing no-knock warrants completely. Basically, those described as a search warrant that authorizes the executing law enforcement officer to enter a building, apartment, premises, place, or thing to be searched without giving notice of the officer's authority or purpose. And any warrant would also require officers to execute them between the hours of 8 a.m. and 7 p.m. And any warrants, any searches ever executed at a residence would be required to contain these parameters to be valid. So it actually was given a hearing. In most situations, a decent bill like this doesn't ever even see the light of day. So there's been some grassroots support of House Bill 27. We'll be keeping an eye on that as well. Now, point on a new bill that was just filed in Kansas, the Gun Rights Preservation Act, House Bill 2803. It would prohibit an agency of the state, a political subdivision of the state, and their employees from knowingly and willingly participating in any way in the enforcement of any federal act, law, executive order, administrative order, rule, or regulation regarding a firearm, accessory, or ammunition against a law-abiding citizen. And how they define law-abiding citizen is a person who is not precluded under state law from possessing a firearm. Now, I don't like any state gun laws either, but this is really kind of moving it closer to home and saying we will not participate in the enforcement of any federal gun laws on the books, past, present, or future. And from Mike Meharry, it would also prohibit the utilization of any assets, state funds, or funds allocated by the state to local entities for the enforcement of or aiding a federal agency in the enforcement of the same. And a very similar piece of legislation was just introduced last week in Alaska, House Bill 372. They call it the Second Amendment Preservation Act, a pretty good name there, basically banning the state from participating in enforcement of federal gun control, past, present, and future. We know the ATF, they have like 5,100 employees. About a third of them are in administration, and they only have the capacity to close somewhere around 8,000 to 10,000 cases per year with support from the states. Now, that's 8,000 to 10,000 cases too many. But as long as the states keep backing off and the people keep standing firm, those numbers will go down significantly. Well,
she asked, what would be the process to restore a gold standard? Today it would be difficult. I made a suggestion in the talk that the first thing you do is you legalize it and let the market help decide when we can go back to a gold standard. It would be best to be international, but if we wise up, somebody in the not too distant future will have a gold standard. It may be India or somebody, or China, because they're buying the gold in the West, and European countries and others are selling gold, and the gold is going east. But we could do it. We could lead the way, but it's rather dramatic. It's not likely to happen because it would require living within our means. We can't print money anymore. So that means no deficits. And the other thing it requires is that the people have to believe the politicians. So if I'm representing the politicians in the government, I come in and say, okay, we've decided to have our gold standard, and all we have to do is your dollar's going to be back to gold at $2,000 an ounce, and everything is going to be okay, and we'll always balance our budget, and there'll be no excessive spending, and we're going to back off on these wars. Nobody would believe us. Now, the best example of this under different conditions was in 1875. See, they suspended the gold standard during the Civil War because, once again, war comes, gotta have money, no more gold. So they suspended the gold standard. But times were different then, and they decided to go back to a gold standard. In 1875, they had a Resumption Act, and they designed a 3-year period to transition back to gold. And the price of gold was much higher than $20 an ounce. And they said, we're going to quit printing money. We're not going to run up these deficits. And they withdrew some greenbacks, and then withdrew them all. And by the time the 3 years was up, gold in the marketplace was $20 an ounce. And they didn't go back to carrying gold in their pockets or anything, but they were back on the gold standard. Anybody who wanted to turn in a certificate, back then you had gold certificates, you could turn it in, you would get an ounce of gold for it, or an ounce of silver, or whatever. So it's this attitude of big government. It's pretty hard if you want to finance a government that we should have with a gold standard. What you'd have to do is decide that the role of government should be different. It should be protecting our liberties and not to run a welfare state and police the world. Maybe it'll be when the total collapse of the economy and the currency comes, that's when hopefully somebody will wake up and say, what we have to have is sound money, and why don't we follow the advice of the founders. I think the dollar is losing its status as the reserve currency of the world. Yes, it's less used now than it used to be, and it eventually will disappear. Somebody else will pick up. When that happens, I don't know that, but eventually that will happen because it just can't last forever this way. If it would be true that we kept the reserve standard, and that we could print the reserve standard of the world, none of you would ever have to work again. I mean, why wouldn't we just print the money? And we're, in a way, doing this, we print it. Look at all we buy from China. So everybody gets angry at China, but they're taking this paper and they're sending us stuff. But of course, we end up with debt. So it's not viable for them, it's not viable for us. I think that China might do it. I think they would like to. They're working in that direction. I think that it may be a group of countries. I believe it'll be in the Far East. It may be India and Singapore and maybe Malaysia and China. They might get together and establish it. It may be a retaliation by nations that are considered more Muslim, just because they if they're involved with oil and other things like this, they might be able to do it, and if they're buying gold. So I think you'll live to see the day when the dollar will not be the reserve standard of the world, but that will be a rocky test on exactly what happened. But what could happen is, let's say that we wake up with realization, maybe then we would devise monetary reform that people would accept the dollar, if it was guaranteed and convertible into gold. But right now, that's not likely to happen. People hold dollars. And we print dollars and then they hold them. They're holding huge amounts of cash. We just print the cash, we spend it overseas, and they just keep it and they circulate it because right now it's still better than the rest of the currencies. So if one country did this, our standard of living is going down now. It's systematically going down. This country's a lot poorer than it was 10 years ago, and it would get a lot worse if another country did this and we lost the status. It would be very, very harmful to our economy. It would be much poorer. The Constitution prohibits the states from issuing currency, but it also tells the states that they can only use gold and silver as legal tender. So if they lived up to that mandate, and because we do have American gold coins and silver coins, they should be allowed to use them, and they should say, well, we're only going to use gold and silver coin. The Constitution tells us to do this. But they had a lot of trouble with the states. One of the reasons why they had the Constitution Convention is many states did issue their own paper currency and they did abuse it. So there is a prohibition against the states just issuing paper money. But to use U.S. gold and silver coins, I think this would be beneficial. I think educationally, that's why I like to see all these resolutions, coming up in the various states because it's calling attention to it, and that is what is required. Education is the most important thing that we do.
Is there any respect in which objectivism would disagree that the means to achieve happiness is to actualize one's distinctive potentialities? Well, if you mean by that, would objectivism disagree that the means to achieve happiness is to live by reason? Certainly not. Of course, objectivism advocates that happiness is the means to reason is the means to happiness. However, objectivism does not advocate reason simply because it is distinctive to man. You see, Aristotle justifies the life of reason essentially on the teleological ground. That reason is man's distinctive striving. And to Aristotle's defense of the life of reason, the objection is, well, why is the fact that something is distinctive to man per se an argument for living that way? One very superficial philosopher that I won't mention by name once said to me, what if man's distinctive feature was a long nose? Would it follow then that you should emphasize the life of the long nose just because that's distinctive? Well, I mean, that's really not even fair to Aristotle because he explained, given his metaphysics, why the distinctive was the thing that counts. But in any event, in a way, that kind of objection is open if you reject Aristotle's teleology. Objectivism says that you should live by the life of reason because reason is a necessary means to sustaining life and therefore to the achievement of happiness. But the crucial middle term is the role of reason in sustaining life. The fact that reason is through and through practical and not contemplative in that disembodied otherworldly sense. That is a basic disagreement with Aristotle. I said, according to you, that no concept of utilitarian knowledge was possible prior to the Industrial Revolution. Do I believe that there was no equivalent or partial approach to the Industrial Revolution prior to the late 18th, early 19th century in other cultures? Well, first of all, you somewhat state inaccurately my view. I do not believe that that knowledge was entirely divorced from utilitarian purposes. And Aristotle indeed has the practical reason, which is specifically the utilitarian reason. I said the knowledge of science, of abstract philosophy, of mathematics, they did not grasp its relationship to life. Primarily the knowledge of physics, math, biology, psychology. And that, I say, they could not grasp prior to the Industrial Revolution. Do I believe there was no equivalent of the Industrial Revolution? Well, if you mean by equivalent in early times, that men used knowledge, they used it to make discoveries on a certain level, yes, they did. But if you mean they created the kind of culture which made blatant and accessible to everyone the imperative role of the mind in actually sustaining human existence, the highest reaches of the mind in sustaining the actual physical life of man, then I say, yes, in that sense, it was only the Industrial Revolution that made it possible. Which Aristotle, in turn, made possible the Industrial Revolution by making possible modern science, by making possible the Renaissance. And from that point of view, Aristotle created the circumstances that ultimately corrected his own doctrine. Is believing in something so strongly as to exclude everything that might stand against it vice, according to Aristotle? No. He did not make that application of the doctrine of moderation. On intellectual matters, he thought you should believe strongly, firmly, and as an absolute in what you regard as true. He had passionate convictions which he was willing to stand by. The doctrine of moderation was applied specifically to your treatment of emotional matters, as I indicated in the lecture. Who was the father of altruism in philosophy? Would it surprise you if I said the answer is Fichte? That is the answer I defend in my book, The Ominous Parallels. In essence, I would say that altruism, but you'll have to read the book for this because I couldn't condense that all into one answer. What it amounts to is that altruism, as the formal theory that the essence of the good is sacrifice specifically for other people, not mixing in sacrifice for God or any element of egoistic selfishness, pure self-sacrifice for others, is a post-Kantian development. It was foreshadowed by Christianity. It was foreshadowed by Platonism. There were large hunks of it, but mixed in with the idea that more important than sacrificing for others is sacrificing for God, and mixed in with the idea there's something in it for you. You'll get the other world or whatever. The idea of pure, selfless, total self-sacrifice for others is a post-Kantian phenomenon, and the first famous, influential, philosophical, consistent altruist is therefore the first famous, influential, consistent post-Kantian, Fichte, whose works I analyze in my book, and thereafter all the rest of them. So you can either say Christianity in the sense of starting the element, or Kant in the sense of annihilating everything else, or Fichte as the man who actually did it.